Angelica looked at the wedding photo. She and Edward had been married for 3 years already. Just think how quickly time flies. She looked at herself so happy in her wedding dress. The beeping of a text message distracted her from her memories. It was her husband reminding her that she needed to donate blood today. Then a notification came about a bank transaction. Money had been deposited onto her card. After 3 years of marriage, Edward writes to her only to check on the blood donation, but not for himself, but for Ursula. Over the past month, the girl has donated blood 3 times, which is much more than her body can handle. Yesterday, while she was waiting for him to come home from work, she stood in the rain for more than an hour, and now she felt like she was running a fever. A message came when Angelica picked up the phone, saw a photo of her husband and Ursula, where it was written that he was with her last night, and a postscript with humiliation about the fact that Edward had not looked at her as a woman for all 3 years, and that she was an empty space. The phone rang again, a voice message from the mother-in-law, who told her daughter-in-law to hurry up and cook dinner, since the maid had the day off today. The girl could barely hold back her tears. Her husband's family treated her like a servant, and she endured everything for Edward's sake. But this photo from Ursula was the last straw. It was the final kick in the pants on her self-esteem. In the end, the young woman picked up the phone and decisively dialed her husband with the message that they were getting a divorce. In response to his words about what kind of circus she was putting on, Angelica said that if he was not at the registry office in an hour, Ursula would die. After she hung up, a message came about another card top-up. Our heroine smiled, so that's how he wants to keep her. An hour later, they were sitting in the registry office, where Edward could not understand what she was unhappy about. Yes, she had donated blood 3 times in a month, but he compensated her for it. Angelica understood that he was a loser. He really did not understand her pain and humiliation and resolutely demanded a divorce. What she regretted was the 3 wasted years. Edward hurried her. It was time to go to the hospital. The girl resolutely said that even if this scum in the hospital were to die in front of her, she would not give another drop of her blood. Edward frowned and chided her for such words, reminding her of the marriage agreement that she had to donate blood at any time. The girl snorted decisively and left the building and headed towards the car. Edward looked at her back and did not understand how she could change so much in a day. The nurse asked how Ursula was feeling, and she smiled sweetly and replied that the wound hardly hurt and that she was feeling much better. At that moment, Angelica entered the room with a determined look, and Edward followed her. Looking ingratiatingly at Edward's wife, the patient babbled that she hadn't expected to see her here today, but she needed her blood. Angelica looked at her coldly and demanded an answer. It was she who sent the photo and text message in the morning. Ursula looked confused and asked what photo it was and what it was about. At that moment, Angelica swung and hit Ursula in the face. She, twisted with anger, screamed, asking what right she had to behave like that towards her. Our heroine again began to decisively advance on the girl. Edward decisively blocked her path and told her to stop immediately. At this time, Ursula, sobbing, repeated that she had nothing to do with the photo. Angelica coldly threw the printed photos in Edward's face. The man took one of them and asked in surprise where his wife got them, while Ursula sat with a frightened look. Edward glared at Ursula, asking if she had anything to do with all this. He himself commented that yesterday he actually fell asleep in the ward because he was tired. Ursula, with tears in her eyes, said that she could swear on the name of Alex, his best friend, reminding Edward of the oath Edward made to his best friend in the army to take care of her. After these words, he turned to the girl and, putting his hand on her shoulder, asked her to calm down, assuring her that Angelica was simply very upset, and that was why she snapped at her. Turning to his wife, whom he had divorced an hour ago, he said that they needed to donate blood quickly. The main thing was Ursula's health, and they could talk about the photo later. Edward's ward, smiling contentedly, thought that he was still choosing her and that Angelica was out of luck again. When Angelica asked the doctor standing next to her whether the patient really needed a blood transfusion, he became nervous and nodded affirmatively. He added that Miss Ursula had fallen, had wounds on her legs, and urgently needed a transfusion. Angelica thought for a moment and said that there was no need to rush. In 2 steps, she found herself at the patient's side, and with a jerk threw back the blanket, revealing her bandaged leg. She denied it as best she could, but the young woman showed everyone a small abrasion by tearing off the bandage, mockingly adding that the wound wasn't even bleeding. Then she added sarcastically that she had arrived at the ward too early, that she needed to take a little walk, and everything would have healed. Edward looked menacingly at Ursula, who justified herself by saying that she was really sick and that blood transfusions were helping her recover. Angelica, leaving the room, coldly told them to look for a new fool for the walking blood bank. She had had enough. The girl went out into the hospital corridor and sat down tiredly on the couch. She was so exhausted, it was so hard for her. Choking with tears, she dialed the number from which her older brother's painfully familiar voice answered that he would pick her up soon. When Eugene arrived, his sister was sleeping on the hospital couch. The man carefully picked up his sister in his arms and carried her, accompanied by security, looking worriedly at how thin and pale she was. Accompanied by security, he carried her out of the hospital while she was sleeping. At this time, in the ward, Edward was talking to a visibly nervous doctor, scolding him for this whole situation with the transfusion because of some kind of abrasion. Edward thought about the current situation and thought that he had indulged his ward too much. Apparently, his wife had misunderstood his relationship with Ursula. He decided to explain himself and close this problem. If it would make Angelica feel better, then he would keep his distance from Ursula. Going out into the corridor, he gave the order to his security to find his wife. 10 minutes later, he was informed that Miss Angelica was nowhere to be found. Edward thought, "She doesn't have a penny, she can't just up and leave." He then ordered that his wife be found wherever she was and brought to him. The Angelica family estate was located in a picturesque place surrounded by blooming sakura. The heiress opened her eyes in her room. She was sitting in bed and looking ahead. There was such a pleasant and long-forgotten feeling of home. The girl began to cry, thinking that she had finally returned. Her parents entered the room, and Angelica, in tears, threw herself into her father's arms. The father looked at his child, who grew up in love and affection, and who gave 3 years to a man who did not value her, refusing the status of the heiress of a rich and high-ranking family. When the girl had finished crying, her father reminded her of the agreement. If she did not make Edward fall in love with her within 3 years, she would head her family's company. The returning daughter promised her father that she would never be the same as before, and that her parents would be proud of her. Suddenly, she was almost knocked to the floor by a cheerful girl, hugging and kissing her. It was Angelica's best friend, Marta. Martha, looking into her friend's eyes, said that Edward would regret trading pearls for fish eyes. The girls held hands and smiled happily, just like in childhood, when Angelica noticed that there were documents left in her ex-husband's house that needed to be picked up. The grand family mansion was a gray, solid building, the complete opposite of the open and light mansion, with large windows of the Angelica family. Marta volunteered to accompany Angelica. As soon as they entered, they were met by Angelica's former mother-in-law with an angry face. The woman noticed that she was now a nobody here, a stranger, and therefore she should get out, just as Martha had shamed the woman by hinting at her manners and upbringing. But Grace, as our heroine's mother-in-law was called, added with disdainful contempt that her former daughter-in-law was one of those worthless people who marry wealthy men. Before Angelica could answer, Grace angrily said that she had enjoyed a luxurious life for 3 years on Edward's family's money, although she herself was from a dysfunctional family, and in the end she called the girl a dirty beggar. Unable to contain herself any longer, Martha jumped up to her. Grace wanted to slap her, but the girl pushed her onto the sofa, shouting that her family were rich people with dirty money, and that this house was dirtying her and Angelica's shoes. The former daughter-in-law walked calmly towards the stairs, while Grace, twisted with hatred, screamed that she would throw her out of here, to which Angelica coldly replied that she would do it herself as soon as she collected her things. Getting up, the girl cheerfully added what a fool she had been to leave her dignity for the sake of this family. If it weren't for Martha, Grace would have been ready to chase after her daughter-in-law. When the girls, having collected the documents, were leaving, Grace shouted that there was no way back, let her not even dream of it, and cheerfully threw out that she had divorced her precious son. As soon as Edward stepped into the house, his mother immediately asked about the divorce. He stared at her in surprise and asked how she knew about it. Having learned from his mother everything that had happened, Edward told his mother that the girl had not asked for a penny, to which the mother angrily remarked that someone like his now ex would not let go of her own, which meant she was hatching a plan to rob them. Edward sadly realized that his family hated Angelique, and he didn't even notice it. On the contrary, he thought that they treated her well, so maybe she filed for divorce because of his mother. When he got to the room, he saw her bank card, realizing that Angelica had only taken her things. At that moment, his mother burst into the room screaming that the necklace called the Lost Dream had gone missing, and she knew that the thief was none other than the beggar woman they had taken in. While Grace was screaming that she would call the police, His gaze fell on his and Angelica's wedding photo, and the man realized that in 3 years of marriage, he had never given her jewelry. When Edward barked that his mother didn't dare call the police, she angrily said that she would deal with her without the police. At this time, Angelica and her friend returned to their mansion. Martha was indignant at how Grace behaved, to which Angelica replied that everything was already in the past. Suddenly, they caught someone's gaze. Eugene was sitting on the sofa with a book in his hands and looking at the girls. Angelica ran up and pressed herself against her older brother, asking where he had been for so long, to which the man, with a gentle smile, noted that there were important matters in the company. Then he added that he had prepared a gift for his sister and handed her a package with a new model of their development, which had not yet been released for sale. Afterwards, he approached the embarrassed Martha and handed the gift to her as well, since he knew that she would come with his sister. Martha blushed. Eugene did not take his eyes off her. Angelica was watching this picture, realizing that they were in love with each other. It was obvious. Afterwards, the girl began to ask where their other 2 brothers were, but according to Eugene, they were all busy with projects and couldn't come yet, but he himself would introduce her to the company's affairs. At night, Angelica was awakened by a phone call, and Marta's number appeared. Marta rattled off that the entire internet was full of news about how Angelica had stolen a necklace from the Grands, and they had set a condition for its return by tomorrow, or the police would arrive. Our heroine lay there and couldn't utter a word. She didn't expect such meanness even from them. The girl read the news. They wrote about her as some kind of beggar who had never seen money. As a thief, the comments were full of gossip and speculation. Angelica interrupted Martha, who was angrily typing after another line, and told her that she would find a way to put an end to this gossip. She called Eugene and asked who runs their brother's entertainment company. Although the company is registered in her name, the relative wanted to help his sister, but she said that she would do everything herself. The next morning, posts appeared on the internet about a private detective who found out that a certain miss was spending money in a world casino, and a photo of a girl in a casino and a necklace next to her. The young woman's gaze stopped on the photo on the phone, where her now ex-husband and this impudent woman were, and a painful pang ran through her chest. Well, another portion of information for the people is ready. The girl tiredly closed her eyes, thinking about how blindly she had married and who her husband really was. In the morning, Edward called his assistant and indignantly shouted at who dared to send the news on behalf of the company, to which the employee replied that according to Haiyang entertainment law, the news must hang for 24 hours. They cannot remove it earlier. Edward could not understand how this was even possible, where his wife got such opportunities. He called his father and told him to delete the police report, but he heard his mother screaming on the other end of the line. The mother's screams continued, screaming that just let that brat, that is, his now ex-wife, show up and teach her a lesson. When Edward said that his wife was not guilty, she screamed hysterically that the girl had disgraced them all. Edward replied that he might as well just apologize. After all, her mother had accused her of stealing, but it wasn't her fault. Realizing that he couldn't convince his relative, the man hung up and asked his people if they had found his wife, but received a negative answer. He was scrolling through his wife's posts, where she posted the idol of their 3-year marriage. Here is breakfast, and here is him picking her up from work. At that moment, he realized that he did not know her at all. As he scrolled through the feed, the images began to freeze, and then everything was deleted. He realized that his wife, now ex, deleted all history for 3 years. 3 years of marriage were simply erased. He squinted angrily, and looking out the window, hissed that he would get Angelica wherever they were. Edward walked arm in arm with Ursula. There were crowds of people around, journalists, camera flashes, but he was the head of a large corporation and was obliged to appear in society. He shook hands and said the usual phrases, while Ursula held his arm and was incredibly happy. She was with him at such an event. Another luxury car pulled up. Eugene got out, people started whispering, and Edward, seeing a woman about to get out of the car, was surprised, since this gentleman had never been seen with women before. Imagine Edward's surprise when he saw that the stranger was Angelica. She was gorgeous. A luxurious black dress emphasized her graceful figure. Expensive jewelry added gloss. It was time to move on to the banquet, but he could not take his eyes off her. Surprise, admiration, some kind of inner fire engulfed the man. Angelica, looking at her ex-husband and his companion, thought how quickly she had ensnared him. Seeing where his sister was looking, Eugene calmly said that his older brother was nearby, and there was no need to be afraid, to which the girl replied that it was not she who needed to be afraid. When Angelica and her brother caught up with Edward and Ursula, her ex shook Eugene's hand, noting that he had heard a lot about him and introduced himself. The president of a large corporation, Edward Grand, looked at his ex-wife, who held herself like a real aristocrat, amazed at her changes. Ursula watched her partner's gaze and knew she couldn't lose him to this girl again. Then she added sarcastically to Angelica that she was doing here. Places like this were expensive, and she had no money. Her brother remarked that Miss Ursula must be some boss's daughter, to which she stated that Angelica had recently divorced her Edward. Eugene put Ursula in her place, noting that his companion, despite her divorce, was not prohibited from attending such events. Ursula became embarrassed and noticeably nervous, not knowing what to say. Angelica looked at her disdainfully and said that she had no idea that she needed to report her movements to anyone, much less to her. As a result, Edward, with his eyes downcast, did not know how to continue the conversation, and Ursula, having lost confidence, again felt the lifelong status of a mistress. Eugene decided it was time for him and his sister to move on, and he swore loudly enough for Edward's friend to hear that President Grand needed to be more selective in his choice of companions. Edward kept turning around to look at his ex and her new man, thinking about how quickly she had forgotten him. Angelica went up to the roof of the hotel, where the swimming pool was located, and enjoying a cocktail while looking at the evening city. Ursula came up to her from behind and began to interrogate her about why she had come to this party, concluding that it was clearly to get closer to Edward. Her rival again pricked her with her status as a mistress, and that the whole town knew about it. Then Ursula declared that Angelica was just an abandoned woman in a rented dress and jewelry. Here, Angelica's patience came to an end. She calmly looked into the eyes of the boor standing in front of her and declared that she had asked for it. A few seconds later, Ursula flew into the pool. At her screams, the guests came running, and Edward and Eugene stood in front of everyone. Angelica remembered how everything repeated itself 3 years ago on the day of her wedding. Ursula insulted her by saying that Edward married her only to donate blood, and was also thrown into the pool by Angelica with screams. She thought, wow, it happened exactly the same. Meanwhile, Ursula screamed and shouted that they wanted to kill her and asked for help. And just like 3 years ago, having abandoned Angelica, he again rushed to save this scoundrel. The young woman remembered herself that day, how painful it was for her, when before her eyes, Edward was so caring and tenderly worried about Ursula, pulling her out of the water. When Edward pulled Ursula out, she saw the people and decided to play the virtuous and lamented that Angelica was not guilty. She did not do it on purpose. Angelica burst out laughing and looking at the dumbfounded Edward. She said how much she could bite on this trick, after which she demonstratively climbed onto the balcony and threw a wad of money at Edward, saying that she had repaid her debt to her ex and mockingly advising him to hurry up before others took it all. Edward motioned to the sobbing Ursula to wait in the hall, ignoring her protests. Edward decided to find his ex-wife and talk to her. He was told that she was with a companion in the ballroom. Entering the hall, he saw Eugene carefully feeling Angelica's ankle. Edward called out to her sharply. The girl was about to rise, taking the hand extended by her older brother. Eugene, seeing Edward's face, which was irritated and angry, noticed that the man apparently did not come to console his lady. Edward flinched as Eugene placed his hand on Angelica's shoulder. Edward, trying to restrain himself, said that she could tell him everything if she had any complaints, but not take it out on the innocent Ursula. Angelica smirked mockingly and contemptuously when she heard that she should apologize, saying that if she didn't, he would probably push her into the water or hit her too. To his words about kindness and the fact that they were ex-spouses, the woman coldly said that she was cruel by nature, gritting her teeth in anger. Edward ran out of the room. Eugene looked at his sister and tried to understand if she still had any feelings for this man. Angelica understood this from her brother's eyes, and smiling, assured him that she had made more mistakes in the past. Edward was driving in the car and was silent. He wanted to think everything over, but at that time Ursula pitifully begged him to believe her. She was not guilty of anything. Suddenly, the driver pointed at a billboard showing a scene of a hotel rooftop pool. The whole town could see and hear what really provoked Angelica to send Ursula into the water. And the finale was the sound of a splash and Ursula falling into the pool. Edward clenched his fists and ordered the driver to stop, his companion screaming and begging him to let her explain. She screamed that his crazy ex would not have put all this on public display otherwise. Edward turned to her and said that today was her last time in the city. The man looked at the city billboard screen, where the scene by the pool was again playing, and wondered what was true about his marriage. Had Ursula been lying all this time? A car horn honked, and his friend Louis, a rich playboy who was married, pulled up next to him. A friend offered to give him a ride and commented on what was happening on the screen, concluding that it was right that he divorced this girl. Otherwise, she would have destroyed his family. Edward barked at him to stop, but his friend wasn't offended at all. A second later, he even suggested going out for a drink and relaxing, to which Edward agreed. A few days later, at night, Angelica and her brother were sitting in one of the most elite restaurants in the city and discussing the lessons the girl should take in the company in order to get up to speed. The brother suggested joining the company, Julie, who have a project. The girl happily expressed a desire to try her hand. Eugene noted that he would soon be leaving abroad on business, but their third brother would return and be able to help her. Angelica beamed. She will see her brother. At that moment, behind her, she heard a loud female screech asking how she got there, calling the girl trash that needed to be thrown out of such a place. The manager tried to calm the guest down, but she pointed at Angelica and shouted that she had disgraced her in front of her friends and made her look like a thief who was wanted by the police. The manager looked at Angelica and Eugene while greeting the president. Grace's ex-mother-in-law supported the girl, shouting that she had been thrown out of the Grand family, so what right did she have to be here? Here Eugene intervened, declaring that they had bad manners and an amazing ability to turn everything upside down, in general, a shameless family. The women started screaming even louder to throw the couple out of the restaurant, to which the manager replied that the main shareholder of their restaurant was sitting in front of them. Angelica calmed the manager with a smile, assuring him that there was no point in ruining such a wonderful dinner because of these women. The girl, whose name was Laura, turned purple and said that they didn't care what position Angelica had achieved. She could take away her job in the city with the snap of her fingers. When Angelica asked what she wanted from her, Laura smiled sarcastically and ordered her to first apologize and pour some wine. But in the end, she didn't get used to it, saying that she was serving their family anyway. Our heroine sighed and calmly agreed, took a glass and poured red wine. Laura was filled with pride and self-satisfaction. She was sitting at the table when suddenly red wine poured on her head. Angelica leaned over to the shocked girl and asked her to remember that she had filed for divorce, and if she heard even one rude word from her again, then her life would seem unpleasant. The former mother-in-law ran up to her screaming daughter, yelled obscene language at her former daughter-in-law, and demanded a waiter. Approaching her brother, Angelica noticed that the air in the cafe was bad, and it was time to go to the VIP room. All the customers were looking at Grace and Laura, and a low hum was heard throughout the room. In anger, Laura Grand hissed after the departing Angelica that she would never forgive her for this. As soon as Edward drove up to the restaurant for them, Laura, like a capricious little girl, rushed to her brother, whining, telling him how this scoundrel had humiliated her in front of everyone. At this time, Angelica and her brother were walking arm in arm to their car. Laura made an angry face and said that she got into trouble because of her. Edward walked up to his ex-wife and took her hand. Edward thought that she couldn't just pour wine on his sister and asked for an explanation. Angelica replied that she really did pour red wine on his rude sister. Laura was jubilant and asked Edward to make this scumbag kneel before her and apologize. The ex-wife smiled and, looking slyly at Edward, asked if he really wanted her to kneel. Then she turned around and told President Grand that the restaurant's camera footage was available at any time, and added to Laura that she was behaving so pathetically, considering her shady dealings, which her family always covered up. The older brother added to Laura that if you attack, be prepared to answer for your actions. Laura whined like a little girl that she was accused of stealing the necklace, which she did not steal, but simply took. She is a member of the family, and she simply said a few words, nothing more. Our heroine smiled contentedly and told them that she was not the obedient lamb she had been before, and if something like this happened again, the punishment would be different. Eugene repeated about 24/7 access to camera footage. Edward simply watched the car drive away and did not recognize his former quiet, cautious, and gentle wife. Laura started talking about how she had simply taught the little brat a lesson, who had been fed and clothed by their family for 3 years, to which Edward barked at her to stop. Edward asked his sister for an explanation about the necklace, to which she replied that his wife had nowhere to wear expensive jewelry anyway, and she was his sister. Edward decided to watch the video from the cameras, and Laura screamed that Angelica had probably been hanging out with this guy during her marriage and was supporting him with Edward's money. Edward ordered her to shut up. While watching the CCTV cameras, he saw the full picture and thought that his family had been humiliating his wife throughout their marriage. Angelica's counterattack certainly shocked his mother and sister, but it was fair. In the end, he watched it to the end in silent thoughtfulness. Then he turned to his sister and said that judging by this video, they were constantly bullying Angelica, Now they needed to apologize. Laura screamed that she would rather die than apologize to this piece of crap. Edward sternly added that the man who was with his ex was a very important person in the city, and she should not dare to talk to him like that again. Laura grimaced in anger. Well, that's how it all turned out. She picked up the phone and dialed the number, saying that Angelica was humiliating her and that she needed help. Angelica sat in her office listening to information from a trusted person that the Grand Company, through sources, hired a person to photograph her and put her in a bad light. A brother came up with coffee and asked if she needed help, to which the girl replied that she could take a photo if that's what they wanted and smiled. The young woman drank coffee and praised her brother, saying that no barista in the world could compare to his coffee. She then added that she was starting work at the company tomorrow and needed the vice president's help for a few days to get up to speed. Marta suggested to celebrate this event by going to a bar and having a good time. Angelica thought why not. While the girls were dancing, someone threw a pill into the glass. When the girls returned to the table, Angelica said that she was going to the restroom, and Marta took a glass of cocktail and began to drink. The satisfied guy watched her with a grin. When Martha had drunk almost everything, he approached her, hugged her casually, and asked if the cutie wanted to have some fun. Angelica came out of the restroom and saw some guy pulling her friend off the table and trying to take her somewhere, and something was clearly wrong with the girl. She stepped forward bravely and commanded in a commanding tone to demand that her friend be released. The impudent man, grinning, said that after she herself drank the contents of the glass, at that time a red-haired girl approached Angelica and whispered that this was a famous bandit. Angelica replied that she should let her friend go and have a drink. The bandit pushed away Marta, who was barely standing on her feet, and thought about how much fun he would have today. Angelica asked the red-haired visitor to take care of her friend for now. Our heroine took the glass, turned away, pretending to drink. At this time, the impudent fellow had already extended his hand to her. With a sharp movement, the girl hit the boar on the head with all her might with a bottle of wine. Then she twisted him so professionally that the guy begged to let go, screaming in pain. The visitors stood in awe, admiring how the girl tied up the strong man. Then Angelica took a glass of red wine and ordered the guy to drink it, or she would pour it down his throat herself. He tried to resist as best he could, muttering that he was wrong. In the end, Angelica made him drink the whole glass, after which she shook her hands and said that it was unpleasant to meet scum like him. Then she approached the red-haired woman and thanked her for taking care of Martha. Following Angelica and Marta as they left, the girls and boys whispered admiringly that she was not a knight, but a real queen. At this time, the secret stranger was taking a photo with a satisfied smile. Then he called on the phone and said that he took beautiful photos of Angelica beating up a guy in a bar, which would ruin her reputation on the internet. A guy sitting at a table in a restaurant with a crooked smile ordered to publish. Louis smiled and believed that now this ungrateful fox who insulted Laura and humiliated his friend would pay for everything. The next morning, Marta burst into the room where Angelica was getting ready for work, angrily shouting that the girl was being banned from the internet again. Angelica, combing her hair, was surprised why she was being banned and what happened again. Marta started to tell that there was a video edited online of Angelica beating up a guy in a bar, and people started writing negative comments. And she showed the video on her phone. Angelica was calm and told Marta to just not look, then she wouldn't have to be nervous. But the friend firmly decided to resolve the situation if they were hating Angelica because of her. At this time, the butler came up and said that the driver and car were waiting for the miss, to which the heiress replied that she did not want to attract attention and would go to work like everyone else. The butler proudly added that the gentleman had ordered cars, but they were still on the way, but she could take any of the latest Maserati or Porsche models. Angelica thought with a smile that in her family such models were called working ones. The butler asked Martha to take care of the young miss. At this time, the company was about to announce a new manager when Eugene entered the conference room with Angelica and introduced the girl as the new director of the company. One of the employees turned purple with anger. She had worked for the company for so many years, and the position should have gone to her. She stepped forward and asked what Miss Angelica's talent was, other than being the adopted daughter of a wealthy family for 3 years. The girl said that she would not work under such conditions, to which Eugene calmly noted that it was her right and she could leave. The employee turned pale with anger. Just think, Mr. Eugene prefers this new girl to her, the one who has given years to this company. But then she apologized and asked for forgiveness for such an impulsive attack on her part. And having pulled herself together, she added that she respected the company's decision and would work with Miss Angelica. Seeing off the new boss with angry eyes, I thought that she would remember everything, Because of her, I made myself look like an idiot today." At lunchtime, a happy Marta entered the office and said that she had whitewashed her friend's reputation by placing a telephone in front of Angelica. The full video with all the details was circulating on the internet, where commentators admired Angelica, noting that with a friend like that, you don't even need a boyfriend. When Angelica asked where she found the full video, Marta just smiled contentedly and added that one phone call decided everything. Then the girls laughed, and Marta added that she would not allow anyone to criticize her friend. Angelica thought about it when she heard that Luis, her ex's friend, was behind it all, which meant Edward was involved in it too. Angelica said that she would pay this boor back, and Marta happily reported the incriminating evidence she had prepared. She showed a photo of Luis hugging two girls, clearly not of a business nature, just at the time when he had just gotten married. Angelica posted this photo and captioned it, saying that she doesn't do secret surveillance and invites Louis to meet openly. The girls laughed in anticipation of an interesting show. Louis flew into Edward's office screaming, shoving a photo on his phone at him and shouting that his wife wanted a divorce and had done this to him. Edward looked and calmly added that Louis was the first to humiliate Angelica on the internet, and she only responded to him. Louis barely restrained himself from bursting into hysterics, exclaiming that he only wanted to teach a lesson and didn't know the video had been cut off. When his friend said that he wanted to avenge Edward's sister, he only added that his sister does not learn from her mistakes. When his friend complained that he was being thrown out of the house, Edward replied that it was all his own fault and that he needed to apologize to the one he wanted to spite. When his friend asked why he should apologize to this hypocrite, Edward stood up and said that it was time for him to go to a meeting and let him do as he knew best. Louis eventually instructed the communications department to issue an apology to Angelica on behalf of his account. Marta showed this to Angelica with pleasure, noticing that the guy turned out to be frail and less than 2 hours had passed. At this time, there was a knock, and an employee entered the office who had been indignant in the morning and asked to speak to the new boss. Angelica said that she had no secrets from her friend. Then the woman apologized for the incident in the morning and asked permission to bring Miss Angelica up to date. She put the project in front of the girl, assuring her that it would help her gain a foothold in the company. Angelica found this a suspicious move. Angelica said she would think about it and asked to call her Miss President or President Angelica. The employee chirped hypocritically, thinking that this upstart was behaving this way because President Eugene supported her. The woman left the office, and Marta and Angelica began to discuss this act. Marta was indignant about how she was talking to the new director, to which her friend noted that she could not calm down with the fact that the director's chair was not given to her. Marta cheerfully promised to figure out what was going on here. She then added that she and her friends had a chat where they secretly criticized Edward when Angelica was married, and today everyone was going to celebrate the divorce, and she invited her friend to join. Edward and Louis arrived at the nightclub in the evening and saw Angelica and Marta. Angelica and her friend also thought that it was not a very successful and pleasant meeting. Martha sarcastically remarked that Louis shouldn't have come to such places after everything that had happened, and he in turn added that now Miss Angelica had a rich patron. Marta added mockingly that after relying on her husband for 3 years, her friend now relies on her friend. The girls turned around and walked away, deciding not to waste any more time. Edward looked at his ex-wife, thinking about what she was doing here, and it was time to finally explain. Marta and Angelica were accompanied by their friends, who informed them that in a few days there would be a grand show and that Angelica should take her third brother and come. The guy was the head of a large corporation, and the pretty girl was the founder of a world-famous brand. Angelica thanked her friends and promised to come. Edward and Eugene approached their table and greeted the group. Namely, Eugene was interested in the heir Chuck Jr. and invited him to go and play with him. Chuck, calling Angelica his queen, asked if she was okay with it, to which the girl waved him off and said that the Maniacs group would soon arrive and she would go downstairs to listen to them. The 3 girls stood up and decided to leave, as Edward and Eugene's company was unpleasant to them. Edward stared at Angelica as she walked away. When the 3 guys were left at the table, Edward asked Chuck what his relationship was like with Angelica. He took a sip and simply replied that they were friends. Louis said that people like Angelica simply don't know how to be friends. Edward clenched his fists and ordered his friend to shut up, and Chuck Jr. looked at Eugene and asked if he knew what kind of person Angelica was. Louis sat there looking defeated, his best friend not supporting him at all. At this time, their conversation was interrupted by loud voices. The musical group Gang of Maniacs arrived. The fashion designer gave Angelica a violin and said that the violinist from the group was in the hospital after an appendectomy and without the violin, everything would not be the same, so let her play. At first, Angelica was taken aback by the idea of playing the violin in a group so suddenly. But the confusion quickly passed, and she agreed. The guys were sitting and discussing the release of the group Banda Maniakov, saying that the group had taken a break, and they were invited here for a tidy sum. The guys froze when they saw a beautiful, slender girl masterfully playing the violin in the group. Their mouths dropped when they realized it was Angelica. Edward watched what was happening in amazement and could not believe that his ex-wife played the violin like that. The band's lead singer thanked the violinist and said that she performed amazingly and was a true arranger. Marta ran up and handed her friend a bouquet of flowers, declaring that she was her goddess. The musician noted that he had the impression that he had seen the girl before. Angelica stood happily with flowers, thinking about how many such pleasant moments she had missed during 3 years of marriage. Marta suggested returning to the table, hoping that Edward and his friend had already left. But they were wrong. Louis waved at them with a smarmy smile. There was an awkward tension. Martha was angry that the two had not left. Angelica calmly sipped her drink. When Louis pointed out that they didn't know Angelique could play the violin, Martha quickly cut him off by saying that they weren't obligated to report all of her friend's talents, when Louis suddenly suggested playing dice. Edward looked at his wife, noting how bright and independent she had become, but still caught traces of her former, but already so distant, features. Finally, unexpectedly for himself, he challenged her to a game of dice. Angelica smiled and replied, "Why not? After all, what's the big deal if she plays with her ex-husband?" The girl said with a smile. Marta got angry and tried to dissuade her friend because they wanted to provoke her. Louis sat with a smug smile. He knew that Edward was the best at the dice game and always won. Our heroine asked her ex-husband what he wanted to play for. Before Edward could open his mouth, Louis screamed that if she won, he would walk out of here naked, and if she lost, Angelique would have to publicly admit that she married his friend for money and never show up in town again. Angelica smiled and agreed. Edward gave in to spinning the dice first. The girl took the glass and stirred. Then, with a professional gesture, he did the same with the glasses under which were the bones and Edward. Next, it was Angelica's turn again. She was absolutely calm, not nervous or worried at all. Edward kept his eyes on her, wondering if she really cared whether she won or lost. Louis watched with joyful anticipation of victory. They had it in their pocket. This girl was mixing the dice unprofessionally. It was immediately noticeable. It was Edward's turn to show the result, and he raised his glass. The numbers came up 3-6. It's obvious he won. Louis smiled and winked at his friend, as if to say we were handing it out. But Louis sat there smiling meaningfully and waiting. Edward's friend was already jubilant. Martha was losing her temper and saying that her friend could not lose. Angelica carefully turned the glass over, revealing the result. Marta gasped in admiration. "It can't be, friend. You're super." Edward was shocked by the result. It was impossible, and Louis thought he was going to have a seizure. The girl had 4x6 unit left, an absolute winning combination. While everyone was sitting there in a daze, she stood up gracefully and said that she was going to go home, and the rest could play. Edward acknowledged Angelica's victory with a soft, defeated smile, and Marta approached Louis, who was lamenting that this couldn't be, and reminded him that everyone was waiting for his naked exit. He tried in desperation to accuse them of cheating, but Martha, with eyes burning like a predator's, said that one must know how to lose and looked at Edward. Louis looked at him pleadingly, begging for help, but Edward calmly said that the promise had to be kept. He realized that they wouldn't let him get away with it. His friend was leaving, forcing him to pay with his promise. Martha and Chuck Jr. approached the poor guy, rubbing their hands with pleasure. The guy looked so pathetic and tried to beg for forgiveness for the bet. Angelica stood at the exit, waiting for the car that her older brother had sent for her. Suddenly she heard her name. Turning around, she saw Edward. He was standing calm, but still a little nervous. The girl asked what Mr. President wanted from her. Edward apologized for his sister's behavior in the restaurant, telling her that he had reviewed the security camera video and that his sister had behaved inappropriately. The girl managed to tell him to control his family when she was interrupted by the scream of Louis jumping out naked. Angeli took a photo of it with a smile on her phone, saying that it was a keepsake photo. Louis yelled why she was taking a picture of him, to which Angelica cheerfully remarked that it would be a sin not to capture such a scene. A car pulled up behind her, and the girl casually told Louis that if he dared to contact her, these photos would be online. Edward, looking at her, noted that it didn't matter whether she played the violin or dice. This was no longer the Angelica he knew, quiet, sad, uncomplaining, and kind. And he watched his ex-wife for a long time until Chuck Jr. approached him. he asked Edward. He didn't expect such a turn of events. He didn't deny it, and nodded, to which Chuck noted that 3 years is not enough to get to know a person well. He then added that he didn't need to understand her, she was the best among them. When Edward asked what kind of plans he had for Angelica, the guy admitted that he liked her, and since she was free, he wanted to become her boyfriend. Edward tried to hide his indignation, and Chuck thanked Edward for letting her go and opening the way. Louis yelled from the car to stop wasting time on empty chatter and to get into the car. Marta and her friend looked at the guys and thought that they needed to be taught a lesson for Angelica. Otherwise, they would not calm down. When Chuck approached, Martha asked how Angelica knew how to play dice like that. Chuck, who was a classmate of the girl, stated that when they were studying, Angelica had a fight with her family, and they stopped sending her money, and then she was tricked into working as a croupier in the largest underground casino. She gained experience and earned a lot of money. Her family got scared and gave her a black platinum credit card, just so she would leave the casino. After these words, Marta said what a pity she didn't study with Angelica. Edward was driving in the car and thinking about Chuck's words. He wants to hit on Angelica. I wonder if she likes him too. Looking at his friend's serious and thoughtful face, Louis asked if he was angry, to which Edward replied that he needed to worry about his naked photos. Chuck's next words about his ex being such a bad choice, she never really fit in their circle, Edward abruptly pressed the pedal. Barely concealing his anger, he ordered Louis to get out of the car, saying that he was going to the company. When Angelica arrived at the company in the morning, one of her subordinates reported that Mrs. Leia was waiting in the office. Reporting on the planned negotiations and schedule, they entered Angelica's office. The image of Leia sitting with a bossy air in Angelica's chair made them pause for a moment on the threshold. In order to somehow attract attention to himself, the employee coughed, since the woman did not even hear them. The employee jumped up, and Angelica, in a cold tone, ordered that the chair be delivered to Leia's office since she liked the chair so much. She awkwardly tried to justify herself, but Angelica cut her off by saying that she was a fastidious person and would not sit in a chair after others. That same Leia, who was running for the vice president's position, thought angrily that this bitch had simply slept with the president, and that's why she got the job. Then she handed her the documents with a groveling smile, noting that it would be a great deal. The director with whom the contract would be concluded invites them to dinner to sign the deal. Angelique found such servility very suspicious, but she couldn't simply refuse. After the employee left, she gave the contract documents to the assistant and told him to raise the commission by 30%. Suddenly, Martha appeared in front of her with a huge bouquet of roses asking for help. When asked what kind of bouquet it was, Marta winked slyly and noted that her friend clearly had an admirer. The girl took the bouquet in bewilderment, wondering who they could be from. Then she gave it to her assistant to take to another office, since she can't stand the overly concentrated smell of flowers. After which, Marta quietly said that she found out about the Fenton company, with which they were offering a contract. It is a shell company that owes a lot of money, and this Leia is definitely trying to set a trap. Angelica thought that another enemy was trying to trample her. Well, the evening would not be boring. Marta shared the good news. Her mother bought a cosmetics company and offered her a job there. It was her dream, so she would no longer be able to accompany her friend to work. That evening, Leia took her boss to a business dinner, stating that it would be private. So for their own good, she did not take the secretary as a third. They entered the office. Leia loudly greeted the man sitting there. The director of the Fenton company was a small, flabby man with a repulsive appearance. When he kissed Leia on the cheek, Angelica shuddered with disgust. Leia obsequiously introduced the vice president, suggesting that they not waste time and sign the deal. They sat down at the negotiating table. Leia stated that since Miss Angelica was new to the company, she did not know that she and the director were old friends. She was noticeably in a hurry to sign the document faster. When the man opened the document, he became nervous and sweaty. They and Leia both exclaimed in one voice, who changed the terms of the contract with the percentage markup. Angelica, looking at them calmly and confidently, added that she was the vice president of the company. Leia said with a nervous chuckle that she had prepared everything and figured out why she hadn't been notified. To which Angelica replied that she was the vice president and had the right to change everything at her own discretion. The employee was a bundle of nerves and said in a trembling voice that this was a business and that honesty had to be observed. Angelica noted with a smile that apparently the personal interests of Mr. Director and Mrs. Leia were involved here. The director, smiling slyly, handed over his version of the contract, saying that it was 10% less than Mrs. Leia's, and if the vice president signed, then that 10% would be hers. Leah noted that Angelica should find as many sponsors as possible. She told the girl that from her clothes from the internet and the way she gets to work by bus, it is clear that the president does not intend to marry her and does not value her at all. So what is the use of serving someone who gives you meager crumbs? The woman stood up and said to think about her words. The director will give her an Audi, even if it is used, but if they work together, he will get much more. As she left, the woman grinned evilly at how she had pulled it off by putting the drug in Angelica's glass. In the corridor, she called over the worker she had bribed and asked if he had done what she had ordered, and he nodded affirmatively. Then the guy asked in a trembling voice if this girl was not President Grant's ex-wife. At this time, Edward was listening to them from behind the wall and was simply stunned when Leah chuckled and said that she had been thrown out of that family, and now she had no relation to them. She ordered the guy to mind his own business and keep quiet. Edward was overcome with anger and indignation from what he heard. His only desire at that moment was to prevent misfortune. He waited until Leah left in order to catch the worker to find out the room Angelica was in. He ran into a guy who was horrified to see the president, who shouted in which room his wife was. Leah's accomplice pushed the keys to the Audi towards Angelique, to which she, playing along with him, asked how much then did Mrs. Leah earn. He chuckled and said that she was a queen. Leah was not fit to hold a candle to her. If there was cooperation, then she would receive many different benefits. Angelica thought to herself about how much her company's employee earned. Well, no matter. She'll figure it out with her. The director, smiling nastily, hands the girl a glass of wine, offering to celebrate their collaboration. Angelica pretended to drop her phone, and the fake director obsequiously darted under the table to get it. The girl quickly swapped the glasses, handing hers to the scoundrel. They clinked glasses and began to drink wine. She watched carefully how the man drank and what his reaction was. He, in turn, smiled greasily and looked forward to a wonderful night with this beauty. Angelica smiled sweetly and praised the wine, and her companion remarked that as soon as everything was done, he would give her a new Audi. He was noticeably groggy. His speech was slurred. He was hiccuping and swaying. Suddenly, Edward burst into the room, kicking down the door. Before our heroine had time to be surprised, her ex-husband kicked the director away, who fell to the floor. Angelica stood with her eyes wide open in surprise, unable to open her mouth. Edward yelled at her that the wine was laced with drugs, asking if she had drunk it. The girl wondered whether he was following her, waiting for the moment to save her, or whether he had accidentally ended up in this building. The director swayed as he rose to his feet and wanted to justify himself for what had happened. How I got punched in the face again, this time by Chuck, who flew into the room. While the guy was beating the director, Angelica asked him to stop. Chuck stopped smiling when the director's face was already swollen. He turned to her, handed her the bouquet of flowers he had brought, saying that he had come to pick her up from work, found out that she was here and came here. Watching this picture, Edward felt an unpleasant pang of jealousy. Angelica replied that she had already found out everything she wanted, but there was no point in beating this scoundrel anymore. Why would they want trouble? The beaten director came to his senses upon seeing the two presidents and realized that he had to leave, since they were here, and the ex-husband was so worried about this Angelica, which meant that she was still under his protection. Chuck gave him seconds to get out. When he saw the car keys, he threw them after them so as not to be an eyesore. Here, Edward intervened, sternly telling him how he could behave so carelessly and drink wine from strangers, knowing how dangerous it was. As she listened to him scold her, she thought that he was simply trying to teach her a lesson, not save her out of the kindness of his heart. Suddenly, Edward blurted out that this was the life she had been striving for by filing for divorce from him. Angelica felt terribly unpleasant to hear this. Old grievances woke up again. Then she drained the glass in one gulp, noticing that he was not the person who had the right to discuss her life, and besides, she had changed glasses. To his surprise, the girl noted that she was there for work. She asked him what the difference was between this director and his family. Edward couldn't grasp her accusation, struggling to understand how she could compare such things. As she left with Chuck, she told him that in his house she was a maid and nothing more. Edward stood there confused as she was the maid in his family. At that moment, the realization came to him that he didn't know a lot about her. Walking down the hall, he heard the director complaining to his accomplice that the girl was prepared and knew everything. Edward walked and thought that Angelica didn't need him, and apparently never needed him. Angelica was driving in the car, also thinking that Edward didn't know her at all. Chuck broke the silence by noting that he had saved her, and that she was grateful to him, to which the girl replied that she could throw in some money. Chuck joked that this was the first time a woman had thrown money at him, but he would prefer her as his girlfriend. Angelica said that she always considered him as a friend, and he had no chance. Chuck was spraying himself with the idea that he would prove to her how suitable he was for her. Angelica waved her hand, thinking that his passion would last no more than a month. Chuck smiled, thinking that he would not let anyone near her and would achieve her reciprocity. The next morning, Leia was in Angelica's office, nervously continuing to convince her to cooperate with the front company. The vice president looked at the employee, amazed at her persistence. Angelica silently took out her phone and turned on the recording of the conversation when Leia advised her to switch to the other side and discuss the director's attitude towards her. Then she added that if she passed this recording on to the right people, Miss Leia's projects would be checked and she would be put behind bars. The woman got scared and, kneeling down, began to ask Angelica to forgive her recklessness, admitting that the project she was trying to drag her into belonged to a shell company. Angelica pretended to forgive, thinking that she could get a bigger fish through this employee, and in the meantime, she would keep an eye on her. Louis tried to persuade Edward to go to a restaurant for couples that had opened near his establishment, worried that he would lose his customers. Suddenly, a friend sitting with a girl called out to them from behind a table, inviting them to join them. He joked to Louis that he had come to scout out the situation, worried that he would steal his clients. They sat down at a friend's table when Chuck saw the couple, recognizing the girl as his friend's ex-wife. She sat with Chuck, chatting pleasantly and drinking wine. The young man placed a bouquet of her favorite Swiss royal lilies in front of her. Angelica was touched, noting that it was immediately obvious that the restaurant was his, with first-class service. Chuck actually bought them for her personally, but decided to keep quiet after asking if she had received flowers from him at work. The girl nodded affirmatively, asking why he sent it, to which Chuck said that he was courting her. Angelica asked not to waste time and energy on her. Louis and Edward kept their eyes on them, but their friend's remark about how young Chuck could pay attention to such a woman made Edward angry. Chuck invited Angelica to dance on the dance floor, just a friendly dance. He gallantly extended his hand. Angelica thought that if he refused, he would attract attention to himself, so she agreed. The music started playing and they started dancing. They were the only couple on the dance floor. Edward watched his ex-wife dance with President Chuck Jr., and suddenly his eyes and Chuck's eyes met. Chuck smiled at him wordlessly, showing that the one you so easily rejected was now his. To annoy Edward even more, he put his hand on the girl's waist and moved it lower. Edward was at that moment experiencing a storm of emotions that were tearing him apart from the inside. Why did Chuck lean over pretending to kiss his partner since she was standing with her back to Edward? It looked exactly like that. When the music stopped and they stopped, couples gathered around the dance floor, applauding them. Chuck put his arm around Angelica and they left. Although the girl moved beautifully to the music, Louis refused to admit it to himself. He believed that she was nothing more than a rich man-hunter. Their friend at the table called her an intriguer, who quickly found herself a rich man, which made Edward boil. The friend continued, "She is an old, faded woman. All the friends have finally waited for this. They never liked her." And he remembered how Angelica called him when after the wedding he and Edward were drinking, and she called to check. But the words about how he put his ex in her place that night, ordering her not to meddle in men's business and to know her place, made Edward jump up, slam his fist on the table, and order the door to close. Edward said angrily that he was the head of the Grand family, and no one dared to discuss members of his family, even former ones. The guys who tried to support their friend through male solidarity were shocked by such a reaction. This wasn't the first time Louis had seen this kind of reaction when his ex-wife was spoken about negatively. He caught up with his friend and asked him to take their friend's words to heart, saying that they were all like brothers. Edward thought about how everyone around him hated Angelica, and that was probably why she treated him like that. Edward noticed that he wasn't angry at them, thinking that he was angry at himself. He told Louis that he could close his restaurant, he couldn't compare to this, and went to the car. In the evening, Angelica and her brother were at a business party to sign an important contract. Some of the guests were discussing them. The girls couldn't take their eyes off Eugene. He had long been an enviable bachelor, but his companion attracted even more attention. The girls recognized her as the ex-wife of President Edward. How could he lose such a beauty? Eugene received compliments about his beautiful companion every now and then. Eugene whispered to his sister that the president of the company, Julie, with whom they wanted to get a contract, was upstairs and that they needed to go up. A stunned Laura and her friend watched them. When the girl noticed that her former sister-in-law was beautiful, Laura turned black with envy when she saw her wearing a Louis Vuitton dress that she could not buy because it was a one-off and had already been reserved at that time. so she irritably replied to her friend that she was simply looking for another sponsor who would support her for the rest of her life. Eugene and Angelica went up to the upper hall, where the president of the company, Julie, 26-year-old Elvis Norton, an aristocratic-looking young man, was. They greeted him. Eugene introduced Angelica as the vice president of the company. The guy assessed the girl with the air of a taster, complimenting her exquisite beauty. Elvis, talking to the girl, noticed whether she was offended that he had first canceled with them and now invited them to the party. Angelica assured him that she was very glad to be there. The young president asked Eugene for permission to speak with his vice president alone. The girl promised her brother to give it her all and get a cooperation agreement. Elvis stood there with the narcissistic air of a conqueror of the heights, casually and playfully holding a glass in his hand, and asked why Angelica wanted to collaborate with his company. The girl replied that her conditions were transparent, and among all the investors, she did not see a better company than his. The young man looked closely at Angelica, noting that her words were far-sighted and bold. He then asked her how she felt about trilateral cooperation with other companies. The girl tensed up and asked with which companies exactly. Edward stood next to them. So, the Grand Company is a shareholder of the Julie Company, which develops advanced artificial intelligence technologies. The president of the Julie Company, interrupting her thoughts, noted that he would not introduce Mr. Grand. They already knew each other. Angelica asked Mr. Elvis why he needed a third party if he was already cooperating with such a large investor as Grand. Edward answered for him, stating that artificial intelligence was a new field and his company could not take all the risks on itself. Elvis and Edward raised their glasses, waiting for Angelica's answer. Her ex-husband said that she would not be mistaken if she chose this project. Angelica appreciated his advice. He was right. This was a huge profit. You can't allow others to make money on this because of personal hostility and resentment. And they clinked their glasses as a sign of cooperation. President Julie invited Edward and Angelique to dance the first dance to kick off the celebration of Julie's anniversary and their collaboration. Angelica walked away abruptly, irritated, saying that she couldn't dance, and Elvis noted that the collaboration would not be easy. Edward was not offended. Everything he heard from his friends in the restaurant, she was going through enormous difficulties with him. Going down to her brother, who was waiting for the results of the negotiations, Angelica told him what kind of cooperation President Julie had proposed. Her brother reassured her that the risks were shared, and the benefits outweighed the possible damage, and that such cooperation was beneficial to them. Angelica warmly thanked her brother for his support. They were watched by Edward and Elvis, who was, like everyone else, surprised by Mr. Eugene, who was not interested in women, and then they appeared with Miss Angelica. He continued to wonder out loud whether they were hiding their relationship. Then, looking at Edward's tense face, he quietly said that everything was fine. He was there and would support him. At this time, the host announced the beginning of the celebration of Julie's company anniversary. Edward and Angelica's expressions changed when they were invited from the stage to open the dance. Edward approached her and bowed, asking permission to invite her to dance. Angelica had no choice but to give him her hand and go to the dance floor. Everyone present was looking at them. Edward led her by the hand, thinking that they hadn't really even had a wedding. He realized that this was the first time they were holding hands. They walked onto the dance floor while guests looked at them with admiration, admiring the beautiful couple. The dance began, hugging his ex-wife. Edward felt the scent of her perfume, and a tender feeling spread through his body. Angelica had the same thoughts, that now they were closer than ever in their marriage. They danced to the rhythm of the music in unison, thinking about each other and discovering each other. Edward teasingly whispered to her why she lied that she couldn't dance, to which the girl replied that it depended on the person you were dancing with. They had a quiet conversation while dancing. Edward was surprised by her ability to run a business. The girl countered by saying that he still didn't know much about her. The dance was coming to an end, and the music began to fade away. Edward, bending her in the final movement, did not notice how he leaned towards her. Their eyes met. He almost kissed her. The audience watched in awe. A murmur went through the hall that they almost kissed, the way they looked at each other. Angeli went to her brother, and he looked and thought how close she was to him now. Elvis took his arm, smiling. Edward told him that he understood everything. It was his idea. Angelica met Chuck, noticing that he was late for opening. He started flirting by saying that he was only there for her, to which Angelica replied that he was there because his father made him. While they were discussing the events, someone was calling the girl by name in a hysterical voice. An enraged Laura screamed at her that she had no shame or conscience to flirt with her brother like that. She would never be included in their family again. Angelica rolled her eyes, thinking, what kind of kindergarten, when Chuck asked who this rude woman was, who had no manners. Laura ordered her lover not to interfere at all. The guy beamed. Wow, he was introduced to the status of a lover. Our heroine asked Laura what she needed, and she screamed for Angelica to stop chasing her brother. Then she triumphantly declared that his heart was taken by Ursula, just like that, and she was just a means for a blood transfusion, so let him not even dream of returning to the family. Angelica loudly said that the whole world knows about her brother and Ursula's affair, so it is no longer news that he is a scoundrel who cheated on his wife. The women who surrounded them began to lament what a disgrace it was, how disgusting it was to cheat on your wife and not even hide it. Ursula, realizing that she had revealed the unpleasant side of her family, pointed her finger at Angelica and declared that she was selling herself to men, after which she stated that her brother's ex-wife continues to extort money from him, that she is a nobody and nothing, an ordinary maid who doesn't have a penny to her name. Edward heard his sister's words with rage in his eyes and wanted to kill her on the spot. Lara, realizing that she had revealed everything Edward didn't know, tried to justify herself by saying that she had simply taught the impudent woman a lesson. Chuck replied dismissively that he could continue to spill the nasty details of his family. Angelica was truly unlucky to be a part of it all. When Laura began to accuse him of having an affair with Angelica, Edward barked and ordered her to shut up. He loudly asked if it was true what she had just said about the role Angelica played in his family. Angelica answered loudly that everything said was the pure truth. People gasped when they heard this. The divorce turned out to be even more scandalous than they wrote about it, poor Angelica. Edward was shocked to realize that it was not only his friends who were abusing his wife, but his family as well. Angelica asked him, well, now he knows the truth. So what? Should he make his sister and mother kneel before her and apologize? Edward looked at the girl in confusion when she added that he could do it for them. Laura's face twisted with anger, and she began to ask who Angelica was so that she and her brother could apologize. Edward made her shut up. Laura was hysterical about why he was on the side of this boor, and Edward understood that he could offer nothing but money as an apology. But she clearly doesn't need them. He tried to say something, but didn't know how to formulate it. Angelica told him to stop making a guilty face in public. If he doesn't have the courage to apologize, even though these apologies are worth nothing, then it's time to stop this farce. Let's take it. Glancing at Laura, she added that his sister had already disgraced her family enough by publicly admitting how the Grand family had abused their son's wife by keeping her as a servant. Laura stated that she was trying to seduce her brother. Angelica laughed and said, does she really think that she needs Edward? Then Angelica said publicly in front of everyone that 3 years ago, when she married Mr. Grandee, she was blind and would not make the same mistake again. And she added words that made Edward sway, that if she had to seduce every man in this world, she would never return to Mr. Edward. After which she turned around and went, followed by Chuck, who looked at Edward with a grin and how Angelica did it to him. Elvis addressed the guests to lighten the mood, to have fun and dance. Admiring men came up to pay their respects to Miss Angelica for such bravery. Our heroine was flattered and thanked them for their support. Angelica drank with those who wanted to support her and express admiration. Chuck approached her and asked if the lady needed help. The girl smiled shyly and replied that she had really had a little too much to drink. Chuck asked her why Laura said she tried to seduce Edward today. Another of the admiring young men approached them with an offer to drink to Miss Angelica. Chuck intercepted the glass from him, declaring that the lady had already drunk a lot today, so he would drink this glass to her. Angelica went to the restroom. Standing at the sink, she washed her hands. The water made her feel better. She heard 2 people walking towards the restroom, talking loudly and calling Angelica a bitch. It was easy to understand that it was Laura and her friend. The girl wiped her hands with a paper towel, looking at them in the mirror. They did not notice her right away. Miss Grand pounced on Angelica with irritation, noticing that she was plagued by the misfortune of constantly running into her. Angelica snorted and replied that she thought so too when Laura pounced on her with a stream of insults, saying that no matter what clothes she wore, she would always be a poor, worthless person living at the expense of men. Angelica told her that she was continuing to look for problems for herself, but she had remained silent in public about Laura's past, and there was nothing to be particularly proud of there. Angelica felt free and liberated, which was unusual for Laura, which is why she did not stop humiliating the girl. She looked at the standing Angelica, thinking that she had never liked her. That was why she humiliated her. But what? She was still a poor woman and should curb her anger and endure. Then, hitting where it hurt, Laura called Angelica a walking jar of blood who married her brother in order to make money from it. After these words, It was as if a veil had fallen over Angelica. Laura ignored the warnings to shut her mouth, but she continued to insult the girl as a beggar and a sellout. Angelica suddenly threw a glass of cold water in her face. Laura screamed. She held the wet dress in anger, declaring how she dared to stain her Dior. She raised her hand to hit Angelica. When she intercepted the blow with a sharp movement, she painfully twisted her arm and said that she was no longer the same one who endured humiliation. Now she will clean her dirty mouth and teach her a lesson in good manners. Taking Laura by the hair, she plunged her head into the sink with water. Her friend, pale with horror, did not even try to intervene. Holding her head under the water, she pulled it out of the sink with the same sharp movement. Laura whined, and her friend tried to help her somehow. Angelica looked with satisfaction at the lesson that had been taught. Then, turning gracefully, she added that if Miss Laura did not calm down, the lesson would be even tougher. Laura really looked at her in fear, not believing her eyes. Could this really be the Angelica who lived in their house? In the corridor, she met Edward, who tried to talk to the girl. He asked why she got divorced without a reason, but it was probably too late to ask for an answer. He tried to explain about Ursula, whom he had sent out of town, but the girl interrupted him, irritably remarking that she did not want to listen to all this nastiness again. She told him that from now on they were strangers. Eugene was waiting for her in the hall, suggesting that she go home, since the girl was clearly tired. Hugging his sister, he led her to the exit. Chuck followed them, but Eugene stopped the guy's attempts. The wealthy couple is suspected of renewing their romance, and a photo of Edward and Angelica dancing was circulating online this morning and was commented on. This post was sent to her by her friends in a chat. Angelica frowned and deleted it. Then she learned from Martha that Chuck had spent millions to remove a hot headline from the web, and he had asked her to accompany his artist friend to an auction since he couldn't do anything. She was sitting at a charity auction with an artist, a nice guy who was offering to order her a snack. Angelica thanked him, refusing to eat since she was not hungry. Looking around the room, she saw Laura and Grace, who were sitting with their backs to them and did not see. At this point, the host announced the next exhibit from Madame and Miss Grand, an emerald pipe with a starting price of $3 million. Angelica gasped. This is a family heirloom inherited from her ancestors. This is the treasure of old Mr. Grand and is very dear to him. She remembered how she had accidentally touched it once, when she was cleaning the hall, and had spent the whole night kneeling in front of her mother-in-law, who had scolded her all night. Angelica thought that many people would never dream of just looking at this pipe, but Grace actually put it up for auction. Angelica smiled and decided to play with them. When they announced the price of $3 million, she made a bet of $10 million. Laura and Grace jumped as if scalded when they saw Angelica smiling. Grace knew that no one would dare to bid for the pipe. She just wanted to do everything necessary to participate, put the pipe up for auction, and then buy it back. She screamed in rage that she was giving $11 million. Angelica raised the bet to $12 million. The mother and daughter looked on in fury and horror, not understanding what she wanted. Grace, like a bundle of nerves, raised the bet to $13 million, hoping that the bastard would run out of limit. Angelica calmly offered $15 million. Laura quickly shouted that she was giving $20 million. Angelica didn't want to scare them, she just wanted to get what she wanted, naming a bet of $30 million. Grace and Laura were furious and thought that she had deliberately come out against them. They didn't have more than $10 million in their deposit. Angelica was announced as the owner of the pipe. She stood up and waved her hand. Angelica was brought the treasured pipe, packaged, and asked to check its integrity and sign for it. The girl, who knew this thing well, looked inside and, seeing a small red spot, was convinced of its authenticity. As she was about to leave, Grace made claims of ignoring and disrespecting her elders. She turned to them, while her ex-mother-in-law reproached her for the fact that if a rich sponsor appeared, this was not a reason not to respect the older members of the family. Angelica chuckled and noted that Mrs. Grace's memory was deteriorating with age, since she no longer had any connection to their family, and they were not her mother-in-law. Laura demanded that she treat her elders with respect. Angelica looked into her eyes coldly and noted that she apparently intended to teach her a lesson. Grace understood that old Mr. Grand would not forgive her for this. She offered Angelica $30 million for the pipe, to which Angelica cheerfully threw in that if they had $30 million, they would have bought it themselves. Then she loudly added that she bought the phone legally for real money, and everyone could confirm this. Angelica said that she is happy. If she is happy, she can afford such things. Having paid with an unlimited black platinum card, she signed. At that moment, Edward entered the room. By the time he arrived, the deal had already been made. His mother and sister ran up to him, chattering that his ex had bought his grandfather's favorite pipe. He yelled at them, how dare they take the old gentleman's thing and bring it to auction. Angelica turned around and walked towards the exit, declaring that she would not interfere with the family reunification. The former relative started babbling that she couldn't carry this thing with her, so Angelica waved the documents at them, confirming that she was now the legal owner. And she added, looking at her former mother-in-law, that she should look for a place to live, since old Mr. Grand might throw her out of the house now. The mother-in-law asked why she was making fun of her, to which Angelica replied that the Grand family's favorite thing to do was make fun of her. Edward asked how much she wanted for the pipe. Angelica smiled and replied that it looked like she didn't have enough money, stating that this was just the beginning. In the morning, a secretary came to see Angelica with a bouquet of red roses, telling her that Mr. Grand was inviting her to a business dinner. She ordered to throw away the bouquet, and from now on not to ask her if requests for dinner come from the grandees, to refuse immediately. The secretary noticed that the bouquet was from Mr. Chuck, but the girl still ordered it to be thrown away when Chuck ran in and asked her not to break her heart, as he had specially bred this variety of roses for her. Angelica asked him what he was doing in the office, to which the guy replied that he wanted to invite her to dinner. He pouted resentfully, saying that now she was in his debt. The girl agreed, and in the evening after work, they went to a restaurant, running into Edward and Louis. Louis remarked sarcastically that because of her new boyfriends, she had no time to accept invitations to dine with Edward. Angelique retorted that he was very interested in her personal life and wondered if Mr. Louis wanted to invite her on a date. To his outburst that he doesn't look at women like her, she drawled that she was demanding of male physique standards, and his body didn't meet them. The girl loudly reminded everyone about how he ran out naked after losing a bet. Louis flushed and thought that he would have beaten her if it weren't for the dirt in her hands. Chuck suggested that Angelica go have dinner before her appetite was ruined. When they had finished eating, Angelica realized that she was a little tipsy and said that she was going to the restroom to wash her hands. She was a little unsteady as she walked down the corridor, and Edward was coming around the corner. When they ran into each other, Edward wanted to talk to her, but Angelica irritably said that she was already leaving. In response to his persuasion, she replied that he could contact her assistant for all work-related matters. Edward started bargaining again about the pipe, asking her to name any price, to which the girl replied that this topic was closed and she was ignoring him. Meanwhile, Chuck was looking for her, saying that a car had arrived. The girl said that she forgot her bag, so Chuck offered to go get it and let her wait in the car. While waiting for Chuck in the parking lot, she saw Edward and Louis walking by. They did not see her, having heard that the men were talking about Ursula returning from abroad. Louis noticed that he missed her. She'd been gone for a long time. Even though she had done wrong, she was one of them, and the punishment was too cruel. Angelica clenched her fists. They call sending her abroad a punishment. She will show her what a real punishment is. When they arrived at Angelica's mansion, it was already late. Chuck saw that the girl was upset about something. Then he took her hand and told her not to worry about that scoundrel Edward. He doesn't deserve it, and she is his queen. Chuck spoke with tenderness in his voice, without a hint of obscenity, with genuine concern. Angelica was a little confused and surprised, but she was not ready for a relationship yet. Our heroine joked that crowds of girls were running after him, but apparently they weren't enough for him. Louis replied that he only needed one, and looking at the girl, said goodbye and went home. Left alone in the living room, she noticed the pipe she had bought and decided to take a photo of it. A couple of minutes later, she posted a message on the internet asking people to rate her new purchase and like it. The next morning, when she entered her office, she saw her ex-father-in-law and Laura. He reprimanded her for not having learned good manners when entering the office. Angelica walked to her chair, sat down in it, and noticed that she did not have the habit of knocking when entering her office. The elderly chairman, having come to his senses from what he had heard, declared that he had underestimated her abilities, and it was clear why she had initiated the divorce and found a new, well-off family. Angelica answered him condescendingly, demonstrating that his power no longer had any effect on her, that she no longer intended to listen to him on her knees as before. Laura pounced on her as she talks to her grandfather. Where are her manners? Angela sat proudly in her chair and said that in her office there were no juniors and seniors, only bosses and subordinates. Then Miss Grand began to reproach her that her grandfather was old and that her behavior could bring him to a heart attack, to which Angelica calmly replied that this was not her grandfather. Then the elderly gentleman demanded that Angelica name her price and sell the pipe, to which the girl laughed and declared the futility of their intentions. Even if they got down on their knees, they would not receive it. Laura screamed that she hated their family and was doing all this on purpose. Angelica answered her, looking coldly into her eyes, that everything was true. She was far from being the kindest and weakest person in the world. Then Mr. Grand said that he would call the chairman and tell him that his son was dating a divorced woman. Angelica replied that they should try. She would enjoy this picture. When Mr. Grand was dialing, Laura was jubilant. Now they would show this upstart. He called the president and said that he wanted to talk to him. The man said that he was actually fishing right now. Angelica could barely hold back her laughter. They wanted to complain about her to her own father. The elderly Grand began to talk about whether he knew that his son Eugene had become close to a divorced woman, to which Angelica's father simply replied that he had no idea, but his son was a young man, so it was no surprise that he was attracted to a woman. Laura's grandfather said with irritation that she was a divorced woman and his son had promoted her to vice president of the company, and didn't that bother him? Angelica's father advised the chairman to worry about his family and the pipe that his ex-daughter-in-law had recently bought. And having said that he had a big catch on the hook, Edward's father hung up the phone and stood there in amazement. Then he said that Angelica was lucky this time, but did she really think she would become part of this family? To which the girl confidently replied that she doesn't think, but knows that she will become part of this family. She then called the guards, ordering them to take these people away and not to allow outsiders into her office in the future. As he was leaving, Old Man Grand promised her that since she had not agreed the good way, it would be the bad way. When they left, the girl called her father, asking how much fish he had caught, and they laughed together at the recent conversation. Angelica laughingly told how they came into her office and complained about her right in front of her. At this time, the secretary came and said that President Elvis from Julie was inviting him to a business dinner. The girl said she would come for dinner. Arriving for dinner, she met a smiling President Julie and her ex-husband. Angelica got angry when she thought that he had decided to become a go-between and introduce her to her ex every time. Sitting down at the table, the girl noted that Mr. Elvis had lured her into a trap. Then she added, looking at Edward, that if the conversation turned to the pipe again, he might forget. Edward replied that she should not take his grandfather's words seriously. Angelica thought, if he needed this pipe so much, why not? She asked President Julie to leave her and Edward alone. The girl looked at her ex-husband and stated her conditions. Within a year, Ursula must return to her as much of her blood as she had donated to her over the past 3 years. Edward was taken aback and unable to say anything. Angelica continued that Ursula did not deserve her blood. She returned the money to Edward and should get her blood back. Edward asked if Angelica would return the phone to him if Ursula fulfilled the conditions, to which Angelica said that time would tell. Edward met Ursula at the airport. She was hanging on Edward, trying to understand if he missed her. In the car, he stunned her with the news that she would have to return Angelica's blood within a year. Ursula began to whine and lament that she had been punished enough. She could just apologize to her. Then she, pressing on Edward's pity, remembered his late army friend. Would he have allowed her to be mocked like that? Edward thought he would talk to Angelica. Maybe she would agree to a term of 3 years. At that moment, Ursula was thinking about Angelica's death. Edward came to Angelica's work, to which she noted that it seemed as if he had nothing to do. Edward asked her to extend the blood donation period by 3 years, as it would be extremely difficult for Ursula to do it in a year. Angelica was hurt by what she heard. It meant he felt sorry for Ursula and how hard it would be for her. The girl picked up the phone and said that she agreed. Before Edward could rejoice, she dropped it on the floor. Another moment and the broken pipe lay on the office floor. Angelica said that he could take his thing. Edward was escorted out by security. He was indignant, but could not utter a word. After he was escorted out of the office, Angelica's assistant came up and reported that unpleasant rumors were being spread about her. He reported that they say about her that Mr. Eugene keeps her as a mistress, and at the same time she sleeps with Mr. Chuck. There was also a rumor that the Grand family had thrown her out, and these rumors were being spread by Leia, who was getting everyone ready for a party in the salon today. Angelica, dressed in a luxurious outfit, was waiting for her employee, deciding to teach her a lesson and enjoy the show. The girl looked for her with her eyes and noticed a table where Leia was discussing her with other girls. She heard her name and that they were talking about her as a poor lover. One of the girls was indignant at such a fall. It was time to look in the mirror and realize what she was doing. Leia added, "Well, who would marry a divorcee with an unknown past, who is only capable of jumping into men's beds?" Angelica stood behind her with a glass, declaring how much news she had just heard about herself, and that she was popular since she was on everyone's lips. Leia broke out in a cold sweat, stammering that it was so unexpected to see her here. Her companions froze. Angelica poured wine on the gossip's head and said, "This is not a coincidence. She came here on purpose." Leia jumped up screaming, "What is Angelica doing? Is she crazy in the head?" Her friends started demanding that security take Angelica out. What right did she have to come where she wasn't invited? Angelica took Leia by the hand, declaring that she had prepared a special gift for her, and this was not a recording of that conversation. A minute later, a video appeared on the screen in which Leia was having sex with a man. The women gasped in disgust. Someone said that this was the director, whose wife was present today, and recognized her husband in the video. It was a complete fiasco for Leia, who was distorted by helplessness, anger, and impotence. Before she had time to come to her senses, the insulted wife and her husband, whose Leia was showing off on the screen, ran up and gave her such a slap in the face that the mistress could barely stay on her feet. Angelica had nothing else to do here. The show was spectacular and ended on an even more pleasant note. Her and Marta's friend returned from abroad and invited girls to her show. The next day, the friends came to the office of the VIP store. The store was cleared for them to present exclusive collections that were released in one copy. The head manager sat Angelica and Marta down so that they could look at outfits for themselves on the models. Marta admired the collection, noting that they would all look great on Angelica, and she eventually said that in that case she would buy all the dresses. At this time, a loud and irritated voice came from the lower floor. "Where is the service? There is no one who could serve the customer." The managers tried to calm Laura down, who was reading that no one would meet a person like her and that she had to wait, and Ursula came with her. Martha, watching from the top floor, winced and informed her friend that her worst fears had come true. Laura and Ursula had arrived. The manager informed the angry guests that there were important customers upstairs and they couldn't be distracted, and if the girls wanted to get to the second floor, they had to wait until tomorrow. This didn't stop Laura. How could she, young Mrs. Grand, wait until tomorrow? Who could be more important than her? And in a decisive tone, going up to the second floor, she declared that if the customer upstairs wanted to be alone, let her come down, and she would go upstairs. Having reached the top, Laura and Ursula froze, seeing the hated Angelica and Marta. Marta couldn't help but quip that when she heard the noise downstairs, she thought that someone with very bad manners had arrived. Laura smiled falsely and wondered why they shouldn't all look at the models together. And Ursula, without taking her eyes off Angelica, noticed that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. Marta, without letting Angelica get a word in, answered Ursula, "So who is this, a mistress?" The manager, nervous, and seeing that the situation was heating up, made an attempt to send Laura and Ursula downstairs, noticing that they had arrived late. At this time, Ursula was thinking that the modeling show was only available to the important and even more important people, so this was a good opportunity. In a honeyed voice, she cooed that Angelica wouldn't mind if she and Laura joined in. In a sharp tone, our heroine replied that she was against it, and she added with a smile because their breath spoils her mood. Ursula, clearly not expecting such a reaction, stood there, embarrassed, holding back her anger. Martha was delighted to see her reaction and suggested that both girls leave and not waste their time. The manager was still trying to persuade them to come downstairs and pick out models for them, but Laura was furious. This attitude was like a slap in the face. Shouting that she had money, Laura demanded that all the things that Angelica wanted to buy be packed for her. Then, pointing her finger at the girls, she demanded that they be thrown out. Then Angelica agreed to give her all the chosen things. But wouldn't Mrs. Grand want to return them because they are too expensive? But Laura triumphantly declared that she would not return anything, even if she had to throw the thing away. She was not a poor person, unlike Angelica, who was sponsored by a man. Angelica grinned, so that means she wrote down on her phone everything Laura said about things. Then she handed the recording over to the manager as evidence that if Miss Grand retracts her words and asks for the things to be returned, then they can demand the money from the Grand family. Laura still proudly declared that she could afford any little thing. Angelica smiled and told Marta that it was time for them to go. It was unlikely that they would be able to find anything suitable today. Before Laura and Ursula had time to rejoice at their victory, they were shown a bill for several million, so much so that they almost lost consciousness. The girls came at the invitation of their friend to a closed modeling show. A friend promised to transform them and make them the highlight of the show. A surprise was being prepared for Marta and Angelica that they had no idea about. The host began the show by announcing that the stars were about to appear on the catwalk. The theme of the show is Gifts of the Galaxy, where the emphasis is on the fact that each woman is a unique constellation in the galaxy. Marta was the first to present the designer collection. The founder of the show announced that women can be princesses, knights, kings, queens, or even ordinary dust. She herself came out in one of her outfits. The guests gasped in admiration. Laura and Ursula stood behind. Next, the audience was treated to a grand debut by the bright star of the show. The final outfit was called Cassiopeia, symbolizing confidence, tenderness, brightness. Angelica walked out onto the podium in a triumphant dress, shining like a crown. The host accompanied her exit with the words mystical, majestic, elegant. It also symbolizes that every woman is a queen. Laura looked at her with admiration and praised her wonderful outfit and how beautiful the model was. Even though she couldn't see her face, she would definitely take a photo with her. Angelica was majestic and effectively ended the collection's debut. The young man kept his piercing gaze on her. Laura dreamily shared her impressions. She was especially struck by the latest model. Such a beauty, I wish she would marry her brother. But an embarrassed Ursula quietly noted that the modeling world is full of dirt. They get everything through drink and bed. Marta heard them as she passed by and did not fail to interject that if they were speaking about the models like that, then it would have been better not to come to the fashion show at all. Laura and Ursula asked how she ended up there, but Martha didn't miss the opportunity to ridicule their dresses, which Angelica had refused, and whether they really wore them. The girls felt humiliated and put on what their competitor refused. Afterwards, Laura said that she had not come to meet her, but to take a photo with the model in the Cassiopeia dress. Marta immediately shouted to Angelica that fans dreaming of a photo were waiting for her there. It was the final blow when Angelica came up to her and said that not everyone could take a photo with her. Laura was shaking with anger. How could this happen? Why was Angelica here? Then she screamed that she would not take a photo with her. It would lower her level, not forgetting to add that she is the young mistress of the Grand family, and Angelica is the one who was thrown out by her brother. Their friend, the founder of the show, intervened, noting that she had not given the ticket to Mr. Grand himself and how they got there themselves. Not knowing what to answer, Laura and Ursula shifted nervously from foot to foot. Angelica, without deigning to look at them, told her friends that it was time for them not to waste time on emptiness. Laura capriciously screamed with jealousy and despair. Why, Angelica? Why is she here? The designer looked back at the girls with disdain, measuring them with her gaze. Then she coldly left because Angelica is the main one here. She is the star of this show. And she showed the girls the door. They definitely had nothing to do here. But Angelica's gaze was drawn to the young people who appeared at the entrance. She was tracked by reporters, one of whom got wind that she was the main shareholder. Angelica realized that she would have problems if she got caught by the press, so she needed to run away. Picking up the hem of her dress, she commanded her friends that they needed to hurry. Reporters ran after Angelica to make sure she didn't miss her, as she ran past a stranger who was following her during the show. Suddenly, she felt a strong hand on her arm. The young man opened the door and quickly let her in. Angelica, taken aback by the surprise, looked at the stranger. He indicated that she should speak quietly. Reporters ran past the room where he took the girl, not understanding where she had disappeared to. Angelica had a lot of questions, but the young man put his finger to her lips so that they would not be identified. The girl was embarrassed. Her heart was pounding wildly. He stood so close that she could feel his breath. They heard the voices of repentant journalists who said that everything needed to be searched again. The young man said that the reporters had finally left, and Angelica, without taking her admiring gaze off him, thanked him for his help. The guy replied that he hadn't done anything special. It was just a passing help. Angelica extended her hand and introduced herself. But he did not introduce himself, and opening the door, told them to proceed carefully, since reporters were still in the building. He watched Angelica walk away with a smile on his lips. Marta saw her friend and ran up to her, asking where she was hiding, and our heroine told her about the mysterious stranger who helped her. The girls immediately began to discuss the guy, his appearance, how he helped, what he said, but Angelica noted with regret that he never introduced himself. Their sweet, girlish cooing was interrupted by Edward's voice as he approached. They stared at him with questioning looks on their faces, and Martha muttered why he was here too. Edward approached his ex-wife and asked how she became a shareholder in the company. He learned this from his sister, to which Angelica replied that she was not obliged to report to her now ex-husband. At that moment they were interrupted by Laura's breaking voice, who was lamenting that Ursula could barely stand on her feet, having lost so much blood. Edward jumped up to the girls and asked what was going on, since Ursula was showing with all her appearance that she was very ill. Laura said that Ursula saw him and asked to say hello, but then fell and bled heavily. Angelica turned to Marta and said that she needed to go and have a good rest. But the whole hall heard Laura's piercing scream, shouting that she couldn't leave. Poor Ursula was bleeding. She needed a donor. Those present in the living room whispered that it was true. Mrs. Angelica was used as a walking donor bank. It was so inhumane. Angelica turned to Laura and asked her if she thought her words had just been spoken in human language. She, in turn, stated that this was not the first time she had donated blood, and now Ursula could die. This was the limit of impudence for Angelica, and she threw out that it was none of her business whether Ursula lived or died. Edward was also outraged by her behavior and said that she needed to stay and help Ursula, saying, "I'll help her now." Angelica grabbed Laura by the hair and pulled her away from Ursula. Ursula, leaning on Laura, flew to the floor screaming. Edward picked it up, looking at his ex-wife with disapproval and about to say something to her, but Angelica coldly cut off that there was not a drop of pity in her. If he dared to demand her blood again, then he should not blame her for demanding that it be returned with interest. She also doesn't have the talent to be a wolf in sheep's clothing, but she is more than sure that Ursula will survive. And Martha pointed her finger and said that she was just putting on an act. It's obvious. Laura called her a heartless shrew. How good it was that her brother divorced such a woman. Marta took out her phone and suggested calling the police so that some people would not come back here and blame us for their problems. Ursula, still trying to evoke pity, played along with Angelica, calling her savior. Then she fell to Edward, languidly saying that her head was spinning. He urged Angelica to come to her senses, because Ursula was suffering. Angelica was seething with anger. He was again trying to play on pity to get what he wanted. At that moment, a male voice was heard addressing Edward, shaming him for not being able to solve even this problem. Everyone turned at once and froze, looking at the stranger who had approached. This was the same young man who hid Angelica from reporters, and now he is again defending her in front of her ex-husband and his family. His appearance made Laura and Ursula freeze in their tracks. The guy was a real handsome man. He turned to Angelica and asked her to tell him when she was going to meet such scumbags. Our heroine babbled that she could take care of it herself. Ursula and Laura decided to blacken Angelica in front of a stranger by claiming that she slept with Edward for money until he threw her out, and in general, she is a corrupt and deceitful woman. But the young man only grinned and threw at Ursula. A minute ago, she couldn't stand, and now she was talking so energetically. He told her point blank that she was lying. Ursula blushed and didn't know what to answer. The man added that one was faking her illness, and President Grand was condoning it. Here Laura screamed how dare he slander them, and heard her brother tell her to shut up. The young man looked at Angelica with love and asked permission to protect her in the future if the need arose. Angelica was soaring. Of course she played along with him and agreed to accept help. Then he decisively took the girl by the hand and led her to the exit, declaring that there was nothing more to waste time on here. Martha was also enchanted by the noble protector. She got goosebumps. Laura, Ursula, and Edward watched them go in silence, having nothing more to say. In the parking lot, the stranger apologized for having to intervene so urgently. He hoped that he had not offended Angelica. The girl sincerely thanked him for his help a second time. She smiled and looked at him with curiosity and asked him to state his name, and he introduced himself as Daniel. Angelica couldn't take her eyes off him. The name was familiar to her, and it seemed she had seen him somewhere before. Trying to remember where they might have crossed paths, she didn't immediately hear Daniel ask her, would it be a bother if he gave Miss Angelica a ride home today? The girl happily agreed, and the young man thought that it meant she didn't recognize him. The next morning, our heroine slept off the trauma of so many events, but her sleep was interrupted by the persistent ringing of her smartphone. On the other end, Marta was indignant about how Angelica could sleep when she was being slandered on the internet. Someone published several posts where they throw mud at Angelica, and it can't be stopped. Angelica's post next to her older brother, and the caption, after the divorce, she didn't receive a penny. Where did she get a Bentley from? And here she is with Chuck and the signature. Who is sponsoring Miss Angelica? Then there were photos with President Elvis. But the worst part is that all this affected the price of shares in the company. She had to interrupt her conversation with Martha. Her brother was calling. He had already seen everything and told his sister not to go outside and not to come to the office today. Angelica knew that it was old Mr. Grand who held a grudge because of the pipe. Her brother told her that she didn't need to do anything. Her father was going to announce her identity at the company's anniversary celebration. Therefore, the more harshly they scold her now, the more vehemently they will have to apologize to her later. At this time, at the Grand's estate, the old gentleman was in a great mood. While sipping his morning coffee, he asked his assistant if there was any news about this woman. His mood was dampened when he learned that the price of their company's shares had initially fallen slightly. But thanks to the actions of the president, the shares had become stable again. The old gentleman ordered to call Angelica. At this time, Angelica was sitting on the phone choosing perfume. The product was being demonstrated live on the broadcast. The girl advertised fragrances and suggested following a link to order. Just as Angelica was about to go and place an order, an incoming call rang and she didn't place an order, the link closed. Then she decided to write in writing that if the presenter is in Europe, then she needs to pick out gifts. The cost will not be a problem. The manager read the message with surprise and wrote back that she doesn't take personal orders. Then Angelica offered to buy all her products, and she would simply conduct a broadcast for her. The girl grinned and imagined how she would put this impudent upstart in her place. You would buy all the goods, yes. Angelica received a message from her. Today they have sales of 800 million, can she afford that? And a live broadcast started where the presenter told the viewers that she was bothered by a customer who could not afford the goods from her store, and if so, she advised them to think about whether they work hard to afford premium goods. Comments on the broadcast began. Someone said that the presenter treats customers terribly. On the other hand, money is not easy to earn. There were also those who wrote that the rich baby is not rich enough. At this time, the presenter's phone rang, and seeing that it was the boss, she was surprised that it was at such a time. A few seconds later, the coffee was gushing out of her as the boss yelled that a customer who couldn't afford their products had just bought their company and was now running them all. And if she doesn't serve her as required, she will pay for breach of contract and be kicked out of the company. Angelica was eagerly awaiting the continuation. Returning to the live broadcast, the presenter forced a smile and announced that the lady had returned and that she would conduct a broadcast for her, but angry comments poured into the chat that she looked down on the workers. Angelica wrote that she will take everything she has, there is no need for a broadcast, and also she is fired. Well, that was a good way to end the evening. The girl sat back on the bed, pleased with herself. But the pleasant euphoria was interrupted by an incoming call. This Mr. Grand was calling again. She asked him if he had time to personally call her, but the old man angrily scolded her for rejecting his calls. He was even more shocked and infuriated at the same time when his grandson's ex-wife replied that she could allow him to drop any calls. He suggested that she not argue, but apologize for the broken phone, pay 300 million in compensation, and he would make sure that they would stop attacking her on social networks. He will also give her a job in his company, and she will be able to earn a living. With a laugh in her voice, she answered the old gentleman that she saw nothing wrong with breaking what she had bought, and that he could throw the food to his dogs. He went to threaten her, but the girl threw him off. She was really fed up with him. Old Mr. Grand, seething with anger, ordered that they find out where she was, pay a journalist to give her a good interview, and that she should care about that. The girl stood at the door of her older brother's house with gifts. When they opened the door, she pulled out the bags, shouted surprise, and showed that she had bought him gifts. But the same handsome stranger who had saved her twice was looking at her in shock. Still with bags in front of her, Angelica stood with her eyes wide with surprise and could only squeeze out what he was doing here. Daniel said that he came to Eugene and offered to help carry all her things. The older man came out and asked Angelica if she didn't remember Daniel. They had met in childhood. The girl stared at Daniel in surprise, trying to remember. The guy replied smiling that it was okay that she didn't remember him. The main thing was that he remembered her. The brother said that when they were children, their grandfather even joked about their engagement. Angelica thought about it, the word engagement echoing from the distant past. A few seconds later, she blushed and screamed, "It's you!" She remembered a funny little boy whose grandfather came to visit them, and her grandfather said that when he grows up, he will marry Daniel, but she meekly said that she does not want to. How much he has changed. As a child, he looked like a girl because he had a funny hairstyle with 2 ponytails. The girl answered with a smile. As it turns out, they know each other well. How things have been going for him all these years. Eugene answered for his friend that he was not married and was very upset to learn about Angelica's marriage. Daniel agreed and said that he should have come and seen her then. Raising a cup of tea to her lips, she added gloomily that this marriage had been a mistake. Then Daniel wished her to find her happiness and winked. Angelica was embarrassed and blushed. They were close now, and they felt good together. This guy was so calming and inspired confidence. Eugene felt that he had been forgotten, coughed, and asked his sister if she had someone who could help Daniel get settled in and fit into the rhythm of life here. Angelica happily offered her services, and besides, Daniel had helped her out more than once. Now it was her turn to repay. Daniel sincerely thanked her, and then the girl suggested switching to a friendly tone and simply calling her Angelica. Eugene sat forgotten again and wondered if Daniel had really returned here to expand the market, or if there was another reason. Leaving her brothers, she said goodbye to Eugene and Daniel and was getting ready to go home. She stopped, displeased, and coldly threw it when she saw her ex-husband. He said that he came to see her and wanted to talk. Something was always bothering them. The ex again insisted that she apologize to her grandfather, and he would deal with what was happening on the internet. But Angelica said that she is not an idiot, and there is no need to either care about her or reproach her for her actions. The girl was infuriated by his duplicity. She reminded him how his family poured the dirtiest bucket of slop on her. However, Edward only admitted that he was wrong in the past, but if she apologized. But she cut him off abruptly, turned around, and said that it was not the first time she had been slandered, but his grandfather should stop interfering in other people's affairs, or else he wouldn't be offended by rudeness. Edward was overwhelmed with emotion. She was angry. She didn't even let him finish. At that moment, the door opened, and Daniel appeared on the threshold, hearing the noise in Angelica's sharp voice. He looked at Angelica and Edward, and they turned to him. He gently asked if she was about to leave, to which the girl replied that she had been detained by some passerby, casting a contemptuous glance at Edward. Edward was perplexed. This was the man who was at the show then? Could she really be living with him? Angelica couldn't take her admiring eyes off Daniel, which only made her ex-husband more and more angry. Unable to control himself any longer, Edward screamed out why this man had left her house. They turned to him, and the girl contemptuously said that it was none of his business. Edward couldn't find the words. He told his ex-wife that she couldn't be so dissolute. He was interrupted by screams. Reporters pointed their fingers at them, each wanting to get their hands on such a sensation. The former Mrs. Grand surrounded by another suitor. They ran up and vied with each other to put out their microphones, asking, pointing at Daniel, if this was her new, already fourth boyfriend. Then asking Daniel himself if he knew where Miss Angelica got her income from. But the girl loudly and imperiously ordered them to stop, and everyone froze. After a short pause, she added that she would answer all questions at the company's anniversary celebration. Now she plans to ask her lawyer to sue them for trespassing. Then security came out and started chasing away the annoying reporters. Finally, the journalists were escorted out, and Edward, Daniel, and Angelica breathed a sigh of relief. Then the girl chuckled and remarked that the Grand family's methods were so cheap that it was funny. Edward tried his best to assure her that he had nothing to do with it and that he had not invited these journalists, but she turned around with disdain and walked away with Daniel, saying that she didn't care. And now on the front pages, there is a photo of the three of them and a headline that Angelica has found herself a new home and not just one. Under Edward's photo, some wrote that these rich people have no conscience, although this young Grand does have a little. Eugene, Chuck, and President Elphys were all featured as husbands of Angelica, who has an insatiable appetite. Angelica's father was furious when he read the newsfeed and the comments that were throwing mud at her. He ordered his guards to go home to support his daughter. Angelica and Daniel were driving in the car, scrolling through the newsfeed on her phone. She learned a lot of new things about herself. The young man noticed how her face changed and asked what happened. She sighed and replied that not only did these reporters write complete nonsense about her, but they also called him a gigolo. Angelica felt very awkward that Daniel was drawn into her conflict with her ex-husband's family, and she apologized. But Daniel just grinned and said that everything was fine. It was new for him, and even fun. And I thought to myself that I was simply happy that she was nearby. And then the girl suggested that he go for a walk through the shopping center, since he had just returned to the city. Angelica enjoyed the signature tea. It was really tasty here. Daniel had gone off to buy some things for himself, so she was in no hurry. But when I heard the waiter inviting familiar names to come in, I thought, could it be that these two bitches have come here too? Laura and Ursula were laughing at Angelica and the way she was portrayed on the internet, so they decided to celebrate. But seeing Angelica drinking tea, Laura screamed why she was here. After everything, she wasn't ashamed to go out. They approached her, and Laura, grinning sarcastically, said, "How dare Angelica go out in public? Let her not disgrace the Grand family." Raising her head, the girl calmly answered, "Is she disgracing their family? Her brother cheated on her with Ursula. They conspired against her, and she has not yet taken revenge." But Ursula demanded that they stop slandering her brother, and Ursula, as usual, decided to play along, saying that it was obvious that Angelica was very upset. But Angelica, making a bored face, stopped them and asked who was yapping there. The door clicked, and the girls turned their heads to see Daniel enter. He came up and said, "What's all the noise?" "There is no fight." Ursula and Laura couldn't take their eyes off him. He was so handsome. They were filled with envy that he was with Angelica. And then a brilliant plan matured in Laura's head to take this handsome man away from Angelica, and then she would be beside herself with rage. Edward, not paying attention to them, asked Angelica how she liked the clothes he had just bought. The girl covered her nose with her hand and said that the clothes were good, but they smelled like garbage, and Edward asked if he could call the manager and he would take them out. Then they called him, and he apologized and said that he would go and answer the call. Laura followed him, deciding to put her plan into action. She stood behind the wall and waited for Daniel to finish the conversation. As soon as he hung up the phone and was about to return to Angelica, Laura stopped him. When he asked her what she wanted, the girl replied that she was the young mistress of the Grand family, although he already knew this, and Angelica was an ordinary beggar selling her body. When he asked her what she wanted, she pointed at him like he was an item in a store and said that he should name any price he wanted to earn per month. She liked him, and she was ready to pay for him. Daniel snorted contemptuously and replied that he didn't like her. Insulted, Laura screamed, "Who does he think he is? A lot of men want to become her suitors. He was just lucky that she liked him." Angelica answered for him, wishing Laura to keep her luck to herself and not to loom before their eyes. The girl was tired of being persecuted by this family and was clearly irritated. Laura heart-rendingly insulted her as a slut who was dating this handsome guy and was still aiming for a decent family. Our heroine giggled and added, "What's envious?" But Daniel, playing along with her, said that Laura doesn't have enough money to buy it. To finish her off completely, they called her a girl from a poor family who even had to sell her grandfather's antiques. Leaving Laura spitting with anger, they walked out of the cafe laughing. After leaving the shopping center, Angelica apologized to Daniel for the whole situation. He asked if these girls were always like this and what they wanted from Angelica. She sighed and replied that yes, they constantly pester her and provoke her into a scandal. Daniel offered to help calm it down, but Angelica said she had a plan. While mentally replaying her revenge, she only added that he who laughs last laughs best. Then they decided to go out to eat and laughed at the fact that Daniel was now officially her gigolo. The girl was pleasantly surprised. The young man ordered only her favorite dishes. Looking at him, she felt pleased that he was so attentive. Daniel, realizing what she was thinking, said that Eugene had told her about her preferences. And the girl joked that he was so cute that he had the potential to become a gigolo. Daniel laughingly replied that as long as she was happy, he didn't mind being with her. They clinked glasses of wine and decided to relax while enjoying delicious food. Louis saw them and told Edward that his ex was also here with her next fiancé. Edward turned around to see Angelique and Daniel laughing, and his mood immediately darkened. He saw how happily Angelica looked at this man, how cheerful and free she was. This stranger who looked at his ex-wife with tenderness and love made Edward furious. Louis drawled that it seemed like this girl didn't care. She was being criticized so much. But she was still dating this guy. It was good that Edward divorced her. Edward jumped up from his seat in anger. Louis didn't have time to come to his senses. Appearing behind Angelica and Daniel, he told her that didn't it seem like this was too much. If she did it to piss him off, then she succeeded. They will never be together. Angelica coughed contemptuously. Here he is again and bothering her again. Daniel mockingly told Edward that he was indeed very narcissistic, and he barked that he wasn't talking to him. The girl stood up and looking at Edward asked why he was shouting throughout the restaurant. His eyes were filled with anger. He said through gritted teeth to Angelica, what a creature she was. Daniel stood up and, covering her with himself, declared that President Grand would answer for his words. Angelica is their treasure. They will not allow anyone to look down on her. Edward didn't understand what he meant when he called his ex-wife a treasure. Daniel shook his head reproachfully, pointing out that not only did President Grand not value or respect his wife, but he was now pestering her, or was so offended by the fact that there were people who cared about her. The girl stood and thought that both her father and brothers loved her. What a fool she was living in the status of a servant in the house of her ex. She didn't even want to look at the man who took 3 years of her life and told Daniel that they were leaving. But he said that it wasn't them who needed to leave. Looking at Edward with disdain, he asked if that was President Grand. Edward left, still in anger, hoping that they would regret it. Daniel asked the girl with concern if she was okay. Angelica replied that she had fun. And here she is with Daniel on the front pages of online publications with the signature of Miss Angelica, relaxing with a mysterious guy in an elite restaurant. Angelica was called a kept woman who had snagged a new sponsor, and the comments were bursting with angry curses on all the luxurious rich people who can afford the beautiful life. The assistant asked Eugene if something needed to be done, since such news negatively affected the company's rating and shares. Angelica's middle brother called his sister and told her that he was at the airport and had returned home. And would she pick him up? Angelica's third brother Anthony was a famous actor, and crowds of fans greeted him at the airport. He lowered his glasses and realized that his glory was shining everywhere. He read a message from his sister, who wrote that she would come for him soon. Laura and Ursula were also among his fans and screamed joyfully when they saw him. She ran up and told him how to contact him. She had liked him for a long time. The guy was used to it, but he said that he does not give out his contacts. But Laura introduced herself and said that her family were shareholders, and it would be useful for him to have many friends. He looked closely at the girls and said that it was time for him to go. They stood there in bewilderment, not knowing what to do now, but Laura wasn't going to give up so easily. But then Ursula took the initiative, grabbing Laura and running after Anthony. The boy instantly turned into a happy child when he saw his sister and started shouting her name. She smiled happily. It had been so long since they had seen each other. A second later, they greeted each other cheerfully in an embrace. Ursula and Laura stood in a state of shock, and here Angelica pushed them aside. She knows this favorite of all women, and not just knows, they are in a very close relationship. Laura's consciousness once again wavered, and not remembering herself, she screamed why the hell they were hugging. Angelica answered her brother without surprise. That's why he was late. All the dirt was bothering him. Laura screamed how dare she insult her. She has so many men. Angelica began to enjoy this. Seeing Laura's distorted face made her revenge for 3 years of humiliation sweeter. So, bending her fingers, she replied that she was too talkative, and as for her men, she had countless of them. Laura, having completely lost touch with her mind, screamed that she would kill Angelica and ran up and swung. But someone stopped her hand firmly. It was Anthony, the one she so dreamed of getting. He looked at Laura with cold contempt and said what she had just called Angelica and what she was planning to do. Laura stood before him, falling to her knees, humiliated and crushed. Then the guy dismissively threw her hand away and told Angelica that it was probably time to go. Laura was unable to rise, tears of humiliation clouding her eyes. Ursula approached her, watching her lament in impotent anger that everyone preferred this girl. Even Anthony was fooled by her and thought how pathetic and useless she was now. But she needed her, at least for now, and to calm her down, she showed her the photo she had taken. The moment where Anthony hugs Angelica needs to be uploaded to the internet, and his fans will do their job. Meanwhile, Anthony and Angelica returned home. Eugene was already impatiently waiting for them. Anthony told how this grand family tried to insult his Ange, as he liked to call his sister as a child, but he did not allow it. As he took his phone and saw that a bunch of messages with comments were displayed, how would he explain this? His fans threw mud at Angelica, writing that the Screen King's girlfriend turned out to be a divorcee thrown out by the grand family. Angeli was also looking through the latest news about herself. Apparently one of Anthony's fans took a photo of them. Angrily, Anthony said that he would sort everything out and started dialing the number. But his sister stopped him, saying that the day after tomorrow was the company's anniversary, so they would sort everything out at the celebration. On this long-awaited day, Angelica looked luxurious, anticipating the furor that would follow. Already in the hall behind her back, they were whispering that this was the same girl who was seen with that actor and with another guy. No one wanted to approach her because of her reputation. She met Edward's gaze. Approaching her, he asked with displeasure how she ended up here. Her willfulness and carelessness infuriated him. Everyone was just waiting to laugh at her. Without deigning to say anything more to him, she turned to leave when he grabbed her hand. With the most determined look, he told her not to attempt to remove President Eugene. Otherwise, he would not be able to do anything and protect her. Dismissively throwing his hand away, the girl snorted. Well, yes, of course, to protect her. Yes, he is just afraid that his family will have problems because of the connection with her. She was infuriated by this man who caught her eye everywhere, and who, after all, still dared to lecture her. Ursula came up to him with a languid look, and taking Edward by the hand, muttered in a sweet voice that it was probably because of the past, and suggested that they forget all the bad things. Angelica could barely contain herself as she listened to this feigned speech. Then Grace and Laura came up, and Laura said that she shouldn't talk to this girl who seduces any man she meets on her way. Grace added that President Eugene's company will not take into account any sluts. Before she could finish speaking, she received a slap in the face from Angelica, who spared no effort in the blow. Laura screamed, and Grace called Angelica a bitch and said that she would make her dance. The next blow fell on Laura, who ran up to her. Angelica looked at them with cold arrogance and told them to watch their language. Edward looked at his ex-wife in anger. His family was thirsty for retribution. His mother and sister were screaming that he was worth it. Finally, he told her that this time she had crossed the line, and Ursula added that the company's anniversary could indeed turn into a laughing stock. Then the girl answered them all that they were the main subject of ridicule here. At this time, old Mr. Grand and Angelica's father were preparing for the beginning of the ceremony. Mr. Grand ingratiatingly said that if the president had a daughter, their families could become related. Angelica's father abandoned what everyone knows is how the Grand family treated Edward's poor wife, using her as a servant. The old man began to justify himself, saying that the girl did it voluntarily, but the president did not listen any further, stating that he had opened his eyes to the Grand family. Then he ordered the guards not to let him in any further. His speech was about to begin. He turned all eyes to President Swoku. He thanked those present for coming to celebrate his company's anniversary. To tell the truth, he organized this whole celebration in honor of his daughter. Everyone fell silent. The hall simply froze. Everyone had a question mark on their faces. President Swoku has a daughter. Edward's thoughts raced through his head. Then it hit him. Wait a second. Eugene, Anthony, President Swoku himself, and the daughter, is it really her? A spectacular girl, who attracted everyone's attention, walked slowly towards the president. The president offered his hand to his daughter to help her up to him. It seemed like the ground had slipped out from under Edward's feet at that moment. This simply couldn't happen. It was Angelica, his ex-wife, and the daughter of President Swoku. The father officially introduced his daughter. The audience gasped. Could this really be the same girl flashing across all the pages of the publications? Edward continued to try to comprehend reality without moving. Ursula nervously fiddled with her hands. She was shaking slightly. Her mind refused to believe what she saw. President Swoku declared Angelica his heir and remarked on the criticism directed at her, threatening all those who spread gossip about his baby. Her enemies are his enemies. Angelica beamed and looked triumphantly at the guests, showing with her whole appearance who she is. Edward and Ursula still stood there, completely paralyzed. Old Mr. Grand, Laura and Grace looked with horror at the one they had so oppressed. Those present started talking about how everything was so unexpected. How could they spread rumors that Angelica and Eugene were lovers? They were brother and sister. The Grand family came into view, and talk began that it was they who were spreading the rumors. Laura could not stand what was happening and screamed that this could not be, because Angelica was an ordinary orphan. President Swoku said that he is transferring all the shares of his company to his daughter, who is his successor. The Grand family watched as Eugene approached Angelique and announced that he was also giving his sister 10% of his shares and would also become president of the corporation. He took the microphone and also said that he would always be there for his beloved sister. Eugene Swoku declared, just like his father, that those who would offend his sister would have to deal with him. Angelica's speech was the last one, thanking her family for their support and promising not to let them down. Someone in the crowd, looking at her with admiration, said that it looked like a book. It was simply incredible, the heiress of such a large corporation. Edward heard people discussing her marriage to Edward behind his back, agreeing that it was a mistake. The journalist asked Angelica if it was true that her divorce from Mr. Grand meant a divorce between their families. Ursula, looking into Edward's eyes, babbled that Angelica, as his wife, would definitely understand. Angelica looked at the guests surrounding her with a smile. Then she gave a speech in which she mentioned that when she married Mr. Grand, it was not a business marriage, but a desire to go her own way. However, this marriage was a mistake. These words rushed like pain into Edward's heart. Old Mr. Grand thought with regret that if he had known who she was earlier, he would not have allowed the divorce. After the speech was over, Father, Eugene, and Angelica left the hall. There, a distraught Laura screamed that it was all a lie. She didn't believe any of them. Laura couldn't understand how Angelica could have something that she herself didn't have, so she shouted it out. Angelica asked not to be jealous, and said that she had prepared several gifts in honor of the company's anniversary. Gift bags were brought into the hall for some of the event's guests. She handed Laura one, saying it was a limited edition. People were gasping. These are very expensive products, and she gives such gifts so easily, unprecedented generosity, like in the movies. Old Mr. Grand ran up to Angelica's father ingratiatingly, offering to talk face to face. But he said that if he wanted to say something, he could say it here. Edward's grandfather tried to make it seem like everything that happened between their families was a misunderstanding, since the children had gotten along so well before. President Swoku barked out that it was a misunderstanding. His daughter was used as a donor and as a servant. Laura screamed that Angelica was to blame for everything. Who knew that she was from the Swoku family? Ursula immediately expressed her support to Angelica, that everything happened because of her, but Angelica can always turn to her. Unable to look at this blatant flattery any longer, the girl ordered him to stop talking nonsense. And the next minute, The guards were leading Ursula away by the arms as she called for Edward's help. Angelica herself turned to Edward's family and stated that if no official statements were received from them within 3 days, her company would terminate cooperation. They stood there confused, but old Mr. Grand muttered that of course they would apologize. After Angelica's father said that the guests should be escorted out, thereby showing his attitude, they left. Only Edward paused. He asked Angelica to stop and talk. When she, without turning around, replied that they had nothing to talk about, he stopped her by grabbing her hand. Having slapped him, the girl loudly said that he should not dare touch her. The thought flashed through Edward's mind that this was really the end. She knows what he wants to say. There is no need to consider everyone around him guilty, thinking that the world revolves only around him. Edward began to make excuses. He didn't think so. Now he was ready to do a lot so that Angelica would listen to him. At that moment, Daniel approached them with a joyful smile and asked Angelica if she was ready to celebrate the company's anniversary with him. The girl gasped in surprise. He managed to come to the event. A grim Edward watched as Daniel handed Angelica a gift and congratulated her on the start of a new life. Angelica asked if he had consulted with her brother again about the gift, but Daniel refuted her speculations, stating that after so much time, he had already studied all her preferences. Clenching his fists in the anger that had taken hold of Edward like a fever, he watched as the last thread connecting him to her was torn. He remembered how in the hospital she made excuses, begged him to listen to her, but he was cold, only calculatingly asking how much she wanted for her blood. And now he found himself in her place, asking, begging, but she doesn't want to know him. Edward silently began to leave. Realizing that this was already the end, he had made too many mistakes. Daniel glanced at him and nodded towards Angelica's ex-husband, asking what he wanted. The girl was clearly irritated by the mention of her ex and categorically said that it didn't matter. Ursula watched all this. Envy and resentment overwhelmed her. She bit her lips and wondered why. Why does this Angelica have all this wealth and the best men hanging around her? She has so much of everything. Why does she need Edward? With shaking hands, she took out her phone. She called and told someone that they could take action in the evening. This Angelica, how she hated her. She saw no other way out but to take her life. Hatred clouded everything. Ursula convinced herself that Angelica herself was to blame for everything. In the parking lot, Angelica learned that Daniel would need to leave for work. She felt sad to part with the man, but Daniel also noted that he did not want to leave, but he needed to follow the company's affairs in another city for work. But he promised to return as soon as possible, and they said goodbye. When the girl got into the car she was being followed, it was already quite late. As she pulled out of the parking lot, she noticed through the rearview window that a truck was moving behind her. He moved without stopping, intending to provoke an accident at the right moment. Angelica remained calm, and her pursuer did not break away, even when she changed her route. What was wrong with this car? The girl thought with irritation, but she already understood that this car was following her for a reason. When she turned around and the truck was about to brake, she was blinded by the headlights. Then she saw that the car was moving towards her without even thinking about stopping. At that moment, a white Range Rover appeared between her and the truck, taking the brunt of the impact. The airbag deployed, but Angelica still swayed violently. Her car door was opened by Edward, who was shouting in a panic, asking if she was okay. Holding the bruised area, Angelica got out of the car, trying to comprehend what had just happened. To help her, he took her hand, but Angelica reacted negatively, ordering him to let go. She smirked inwardly. It was funny how, as soon as he found out that she was the heiress of a large company, he immediately began to show kindness. The girl could hardly stand on her feet, her head hurt. Edward held her and offered to take her to the hospital. She looked at the cars and realized that it was his car that blocked her from the impact. Apparently, Edward was following her. She didn't believe in such a coincidence. Angelica smiled more softly and thanked Edward. She didn't want to hear anything about the hospital. Instead, she took out her phone, dialed someone, and told someone to come quickly. Someone hired a killer to arrange an accident for her. Edward's jaw dropped as he repeated her words about the killer as if in a trance. Getting back into the car, she threw him a prayer that it wasn't about him. Edward tried to talk, to explain, but Angelica cut him off, demonstrating that she did not intend to discuss anything else. Then she took out a check and handed it to Edward, saying that it was 10 million, 4 for the Range Rover, and 6 as a thank you. Edward stated that he did not help her for the money, but the girl put the check in his vest pocket and reminded him that when she donated blood, he was generous. Now it was her turn. After waving her hand, she left, and the man, still not having come to his senses, looked after her. At the Grand's house, meanwhile, Laura was sobbing, wailing. Who thought that this devil would turn out to be Suoku's heir? The entire internet is against them. The stocks are falling. Grandpa Grand hit her on the head with his cane, irritated by his granddaughter's screams about what they should do now. Of course they need to apologize, and why his granddaughter is such a useless idiot. Grace calmed her daughter down, telling her father that he shouldn't treat a child like that. But the old man said irritably, "What do they think? That he didn't know how they abused Angelica?" Grace was overcome with anger. He was also a saint. He himself was tormenting Angelica even more than they were. Old Man Grand said, "Why hasn't Edward returned yet?" Just at that moment, Edward came in asking what they were doing here. Grace ran up to him, looked worriedly at her son's face, asking what happened to him. He replied that Angelica had an accident, and he helped her. Laura, hearing these words, immediately perked up, declaring that since her brother saved this girl, it means that now they are the saviors of the Suoku family, and they should be grateful to them. Edward lost his temper, calling his sister a fool. They should be the ones apologizing to the Suoku family. The fact that he helped Angelica doesn't change anything. The old Grand, thinking about how best to take advantage of this situation, told his grandson not to cross paths with his ex-wife in public for now. We need to take advantage of this situation and restore relations with Angelica's family in order to get her back. After her grandfather said that it would be useful for them to have a connection with the Suoku family, she showed Edward all the cynicism of his family. The man told his grandfather that, okay, Laura doesn't understand anything, but how can he say that? But the grandfather calmly explained that Angelica was just a woman. They had been divorced for so long, and Edward was still afraid to let her go. These words made Edward answer that this was all unreasonable and leave. Grandfather smirked to himself. Angelica was still in love with Edward. He only needed to submit a little, and she and her family would be at the feet of the Grands. The next day, Angelica read the news, where the Grand family officially apologized, and the girl herself was called the new billionaire. But Angelica, of course, did not believe in the sincerity of the apology. At that moment, her older brother entered and announced that they had a meeting. In the conference room, Eugene had already officially introduced Angelica as the controlling shareholder of their company. The girl gave a short speech about her hopes for a pleasant and productive cooperation. She was officially congratulated on joining the board of directors. Turning on the presentation screen, Angelica announced that the project she had previously led with Julie's group had begun choosing a research plan. A chip appeared on the screen, and the girl said that she would personally monitor the research. And also, people for the research team have already been selected. Eugene supported her for a job well done and wished her to forget about the Grand family and move on to new achievements. Angelica replied that she would make it clear that it was better not to mess with her. The phone rang. When the girl picked it up, she heard her brother's voice telling her that he was already at the airport. Angelica ran with joy to meet her second brother, who was waiting for her at the airport. At that moment, the assistant came in and said that they had found the organizer of her accident. The girl found out that the customer was Ursula. Well, that's not a surprise or a surprise. Eugene asked his sister if she needed help, but Angelica replied that she would take revenge herself. They had a long-standing feud. At this time, Edward and Louis were waiting in the airport's VIP room. They were expecting Sanner, who had been awarded an invitation from the U.S. High Technology Research Association and was wanted by many companies, but he returned home. Louis began to joke that Edward's invitation had apparently brought the connoisseur home. Angelica entered the waiting room looking for her brother. Seeing her, the men became nervous. Louis immediately suspected that Edward's ex wanted to intercept Sanner. Edward approached her and asked why she was there, but the girl snapped back that it was none of his business. Louis came to his friend's aid, asking if Miss Suoku was going to intercept Sanner, since she would be heading the research project. Edward offered to introduce Sanner to her and get to know her, and Angelica, anticipating their future reaction, answered whether Sanner would go with them. An insulted Louis shouted that even if she became the president of Suoku Company, it doesn't mean that she can pull over Sanner. His plans and research coincide with Julie's research. A young man with glasses, Angelica Sanner's second brother, appeared at the airport. He got scared when Angelica jumped up and hugged him and said, "Finally, he's arrived." Then, with a soft smile, he patted her on the head, saying that she was so grown up, but still a child. Watching this picture, Louis said how lucky Angelica is with guys. Edward was clearly annoyed, but Louis whistled that his friend had nothing to worry about. Edward was the coolest. But the next second he exclaimed, "Wait a minute, this is Sanner, Angelica's brother." He pulled Edward. Angelica got ahead of them and needed to come up and greet Sanner. Sanner asked Angelica what she wanted, since he was in a hurry and didn't buy a gift. Then the girl asked him to head her project related to artificial intelligence. Her brother patted her on the head like he did in childhood and assured her that of course he would never refuse her. They were interrupted by Edward's voice asking Mr. Sanner to wait. Sanner turned around and asked what was going on, but Angelique asked Edward and Louis to stop following her. Edward came up and introduced himself, offering cooperation with the Grand Company. Sanner turned away without even shaking Edward's hand, declaring that he was not interested in cooperation. Angelica, enjoying her victory, teased her ex that she could introduce him to Sanner. A few days later, Angelica arrived at the conference as President Elvis's partner. He happily waved, inviting her to come over and announced that he had not expected her to lead the Suoku Company team, but Mr. Grand had also led his company. Angelica was irritated by the mention of her ex-husband, but now, as two investors, they would have to cross paths. She told Elvis specifically so that Edward could hear that she was not eager to deal with Mr. Grand, but it was work, so she could wait. An argument started between Edward and Angelica. The ex-husband asked not to speak like that. They are partners after all. Angelica had the impression that President Elvis enjoyed having her around Edward, so she waved her hand irritably, declaring that she had nothing to discuss with him, and walked away. Elvis slapped Edward on the shoulder and noted that after the change in status, Angelica became different, so it would not be possible to return everything to how it was before. Looking at Edward, he tried to sniff out what he felt for his ex, but Edward asked him not to meddle in other people's business. Sanner, turning to his sister, noted that her ex-husband didn't look very good, but the girl said it loudly enough for Edward to hear, so that her brother wouldn't mention the dead. It's a bad omen. Elvis and Edward stood like stone when she added that her ex was just a scumbag, and calling him a person was already a compliment. Edward restrained himself and reminded Angelica that they were in a meeting room and that this was clearly not the place for a showdown. The girl retorted that Mr. Grand should become the director of a community on how to ruin others' lives, because he knows how to do it very well. Edward threw her a "you," and while he was choosing his words, President Elvis worriedly asked not to swear. He reminded that the conference would start soon and that he needed to drink some tea and get ready. When the conference came to an end and Angelica went to the washroom, Edward was waiting for her at the door. She pretended not to notice him as she was about to pass by, but the man turned to her and asked to talk. The girl boldly put him in his place by stating what status he had to talk to her. Looking him straight in the eye, Angelica emphasized her superiority and declared that he was not worthy of wearing her shoes either financially or in status. He took her hand and asked her not to be funny, but he understood that she was still angry inside. Edward said that a husband and wife are spouses for life, so why argue and harbor hatred? The girl was infuriated by his words. Then she reminded him how she was a maid in his house and a blood donor. She said that he was a hypocrite and behaved disgustingly. At that moment, Laura appeared and screamed. She finally found Angelica. Running up to her, she said that they urgently needed to go to the hospital. Edward asked what had prompted his sister's visit, and she rattled off that Ursula had been in an accident, was now in the hospital, and needed a blood transfusion. Angelica looked at Edward expectantly. She would again ask for blood for this impudent woman, and then she wanted to have some fun, and once again get even with Ursula, and turning around she said, "Let's go to the hospital." At this time in the hospital, Ursula was telling the doctor, whom she had paid well, how and when to take a photo of her with Edward, so that they would look like a couple and get into the newspapers. And if he films her putting Angelica in her place, and she stands there embarrassed and generally sobbing, then the fee will double. When everyone entered the room, Ursula was sitting in her usual sufferer's guise, and Laura said that she brought Angelica to donate blood for her sweet friend. Angelica watched this picture expectantly, saying nothing. When Ursula moaned her name piteously, she went to her bed and asked the doctor what had happened to this patient. He explained that this girl had a crushed femur, so 400 cubic centimeters of blood of the same type would be needed. Ursula bleated pitifully that she admired Angelica, that despite all the insults she would donate blood for her, she would ask Edward to thank her. Angelica threw her purse onto the blanket with a sharp movement, saying that she would break all her bones for this performance. Ursula's face was distorted with anger, and our heroine triumphantly asked the doctor why there was no reaction if, as he said, the patient's hip was broken. And a second later, she pulled the blanket off the pretender, where everyone saw that there was no gibs or bandages. Angelica contemptuously stated how convenient it is to pretend to be sick, to hide behind accidents in order to evoke pity, and also to order murders. She leaned towards Ursula's face, which was covered in sweat from fear and surprise at this turn of events. Laura accused Angelica of being mean and blaming everything on poor Ursula. Angelica replied that she would not argue with idiots and spoke loudly for them to come in. The police officers came in and showed their documents. They came for Mrs. Ursula. They have all the evidence that she ordered the murder of Mrs. Angelica. Edward and Laura both widened their eyes and said at the same time. The police approached Ursula, cowering in fear, and asking them to leave her. They grabbed her by the arms and led her away, and she shouted to Edward that she had not ordered any murder. Edward's face changed when Ursula shouted at him to think of Robert, his late friend. Angelica sarcastically asked behind his back whether President Grand would cover for the killer. Then Edward stopped the policeman and, as he was leaving the room, asked Ursula whether she had tried to kill Angelica or not. Everyone saw how Ursula's eyes darted around as she tried to answer something, and Edward, seeing her off with a cold gaze, said that he understood everything. Ursula was taken away, screaming that Robert would be sad in heaven if Edward didn't help her. After leaving the room, Angelica wished the members of the Grand family to have their heads checked for any abnormalities. Ursula, who was called Edward's new lover, appeared on the front pages of the publications, and the comments condemned this pseudo-quiet one. Angelica was also on the front pages, portrayed as a jealous ex-wife. Reading all these comments and notes at home, she was amazed at how these reporters managed to drag her into every incident. Angelica called the information department and ordered several hot inquiries to be made. The first one should be the death of the traitorous couple, Edward and Ursula. Angelica arrived at Julie's corporation, determined and irrevocably determined to reach new heights. Edward saw her and began asking to talk again, but the girl resolutely drove him out of the way. As she passed by, she didn't even bother to look at her ex-husband. When she was drinking coffee with Chuck, she asked him why he called her so suddenly, and the guy admitted that tomorrow was the anniversary of his brother's death, and he didn't want to go to the cemetery alone. He felt awkward asking her to go to the cemetery with him, but the girl understood everything. Of course she will go with him, but let her not cry secretly, but give free rein to her feelings. She remembered how her brother loved to joke about him, and Chuck realized how much he missed that now. Angelica saw that her friend was having a hard time and tried to cheer him up with all her might. At that moment, old Mr. Grand approached her and said that because of her, their shares had fallen by as much as 2 points. The girl smiled and answered yes, so what, it was her gift to them. The old man shouted in a creaky voice that we were talking about 300 million. While throwing him out of the room, she said that he should ask his granddaughter and her friend. He shouldn't consider her a weakling. And she added that 300 million is just the beginning. Next time let him expect bankruptcy. At home, old man Grand again beat Laura with his cane, calling her a blockhead, a fool, and she resisted and screamed why she had to pay for all the mistakes. Edward was no gift either. Hearing about himself, he dialed the number and replied that her problem was that the convolutions in her head had long been dead, because at least one needed to be used. Laura looked angrily at her brother and reminded him that he was the one who had a long relationship with Ursula. After ordering her to shut up, the man told his sister that if Angelica did not accept her apology, she would pack her things and leave the house, and he would forget that he had a sister. It worked. All the arrogance left her, and a minute later she was begging her brother on her knees and was ready to do whatever he said. Angelica heard screams under the window and went over to see who was there. When she left, she saw Laura, who was screaming that she was to blame for everything and asking for forgiveness. Edward and Laura stood at Robert's grave the next day, Ursula lamenting how well Edward had taken care of her. Edward, performing the ritual part of the commemoration of the deceased, informed her that when everything was resolved, Ursula would leave the country. Bringing a handkerchief to her face, she sobbed, watching his reaction, and wished that after her departure, her relationship with Angelica would improve. At this time, Angelica and Chuck approached, surprised by the presence of Edward and Ursula at Robert's grave, and Angelica teased Ursula that the killer was walking free. Edward told Chuck that he was a comrade in arms to his brother and promised to take care of Ursula, his girlfriend, before he died. While laying flowers on the grave, Angelica said that his explanations were of no interest to anyone, and Chuck threw out that his brother couldn't have a killer girlfriend and a killer friend. At this point, Edward wondered if his late friend's family had disapproved of his care for Ursula all these years. Angelica asked maliciously about Ursula, how she could have ended up free. It was Edward's work. After saying that he was so caring that he even helped murderers, he made Ursula run away in tears. Angelica went after her. Edward wanted to go too, but Chuck stopped him. Ursula was about to get into the car, but Angelica stopped her. Ursula said angrily that she had come to laugh at her, but Angelica said that she would never forget the attempt on her life. Before she could come to her senses, Ursula was hit in the face and fell to the ground. Ursula could no longer wear the mask. She wished for Angelica to die. She should have kicked the bucket long ago, and then Edward would have married her. Edward came up from behind. He was saddened by everything that happened and apologized to Angelica. The girl turned around and teased Edward that she would run to save Ursula again. In her usual sufferer's guise, Ursula clung to Edward's legs, begging him to help. Now she decided to shift all the blame onto Angelica, that it was all because of her, that she provoked her. What amazement appeared in her eyes when Edward stepped after Angelica. For the first time in all this time, he chose his ex-wife. Approaching her, he asked if she was okay. But Angelica did not believe in his sincerity, which she told Edward about. Ursula screamed and complained with a distorted face about the injustice of why Angelica had so much money, love, and she still wanted to take her Edward. Angelica advised her to stop putting on an act. She approached the car. Ursula was still sitting there confused, and Edward was expectantly silent. There was a bag in the car containing evidence that Ursula had hired a hitman. She threw photographs of Ursula, the killer, and their meeting at the feet of the customer. Ursula stared in panic and frenzy at the photo of herself handing over money to the killer. All she could do was interrupt herself by crying and repeating that it was Photoshop. Edward, who until the very end tried to find at least some clue to her innocence, looked at the photo. She crawled up to Edward and begged him to believe her, because he had promised Robert. Edward was overcome with anger at himself. All this time he was warming the snake on his chest, which was the cause of so much pain for Angelica. Meanwhile, Angelica called the police, saying that she found the killer in the parking lot near the cemetery. Then she told Edward that she had called the police and hoped that Mr. Grand would not make the same mistake again. Edward watched as she got into the car and drove away, and Ursula still held on to him, still holding on to hope that not all was lost. Looking at her, Edward coldly said that caring for her had cost him too much, and when the time comes, he will explain everything to Robert in heaven. Now let her rely only on herself. Ursula couldn't believe what she was hearing. She always got away with everything. He left, and Ursula screamed, appealing to his pity, that he was the only one left for her. He drove away without saying another word, and she screamed his name, still sitting helplessly in the parking lot. Angelica and Marta were relaxing in the club, deciding to relax and have a good time together. Martha proposed toast after toast that they had finally gotten rid of Ursula. Then she whispered that she would soon bring the boys. Let Angelica choose anyone. She would pay for everything. But our heroine just snorted. Was she really still interested in that? Marta stood up and said that she would go and say hello to the manager, and that Angelica could have fun. At that moment, a guy approached her and boldly said that he had heard about her. In life, she was even more beautiful than in the photo. Angelica, without deigning to look at him, sat on her phone and paid no attention to him. He sat down next to her, offering her a drink. He would pay for everything, and he thought that President Grand was upstairs now, and he would now teach this lady a lesson and suck up to Edward. He kept ranting about her beauty and asking her to choose anything to drink. He was infuriated that the girl didn't even look at him, only said that she didn't drink. Then he held the glass right in front of her eyes, saying that a powerful woman like her needed to relieve stress. Another second, and the glass with its contents was poured by Angelica on the head of the annoying stranger. He grimaced, screamed, and bulged his eyes at her. The girl asked imperiously who he was to behave like that with her. The impudent man shouted that she was just a woman who had been thrown out of the Grand family, and that she thought so highly of herself. He understood the hand and threatened to give her a proper lesson, but felt the blow on himself. Edward kicked him with all his might and slammed him down when he hit the floor. He asked Angelica if she was okay, but the girl put her hand on him and stopped him. A gleam of revenge appeared in her eyes, and leaning towards the astonished guy, she informed him that the divorced woman was going to bankrupt his family. Then, demonstratively folding her hands on her chest, she turned away from Edward. Edward asked her if they couldn't just be friends. How long could they hold grudges? The girl turned to him in a fit of anger and said that belated love is not worth a penny. Here she walked all over Edward, trampling his pride and self-esteem. She trampled Ursula, simply destroyed her. She won't bother her anymore. The girl saw herself in the image of a queen, a luxurious woman who steps on enemies. The entire Grand family is no longer at her feet, but under them. And what next? The girl smiled. This is the end. No, this is only the beginning of her journey. Angelica saw herself on the throne. Wealth, that was her goal. Her path to becoming the richest woman in the world. Hugging the soft cat, the girl was in an ecstasy of pleasure. Anthony came in smiling as he watched his sister lying around hugging a toy. Angelica yawned and answered the question why he was tearing her out of her sweet dreams, and her brother said that he didn't have a companion for the charity evening, and would she like to keep him company. Angelica closed her eyes and mumbled something unintelligible. Then her brother whispered that a 10-carat American diamond necklace would be on display today, and he would buy it for her as a reward. Before she could even shake hands, a team of stylists was already standing behind her to create the look. She and Anthony came to the charity event nodding, greeting people she knew according to all the rules of etiquette. The girl liked the pearl earrings, and her brother asked if she wanted them. He would buy them without any problem. Angelica was pulled away from looking at the jewelry by a familiar voice asking if President Swoko was also here. What a coincidence. It was Louis who heard in response that it was not a coincidence, but bad luck. Having failed, he returned to the table to Edward, reporting that Angelica was now so popular and with a movie star in public, but did not want to talk. But before Louis could leave, a girl appeared, and looking at Anthony with loving eyes, began to gasp as if they hadn't seen each other for a long time. The surprised guy asked who she was. She winked and reminded him that she had starred in a skincare commercial and that they had crossed paths. Angelica decided to tease her brother, and winking asked if it was his girlfriend, to which Anthony denied everything. The girl didn't appreciate the humor and capriciously asked Angelica who she was and why she was sitting with her friend. Anthony ordered the stranger to watch her language, and she, embarrassed, tried to explain herself as the start of the auction was announced. The girl sat down with Angelica Anthony, who was clearly unhappy. The first lot announced was an American 10-carat diamond necklace with a starting price of $1 million. Anthony offered $1,500,000. Before the host could ask who would give more, the stranger offered $2 million. A tense race for the necklace began between her and Anthony, and Angelica became bored. She looked at this girl and was amazed at her stupidity, which she could not even hide. Having whispered to his brother that if that capricious girl liked this necklace and the stone in it was not even rare, then she could take it, Anthony agreed. The girl, her face twisted with resentment, like a child who had stopped being paid attention to, watched Anthony and Angelica conversing. The brother and sister looked like a couple in love. Miss Julia, who bought the necklace, did not even hear the congratulations. Her anger grew with every second. Ready to burst into tears, she jumped up, hit the table with her fist, and then screamed at Angelica and Anthony what they were doing. She already considered Angelica to be the main obstacle on the path to marriage with her favorite Anthony, and she announced this to everyone. Having slapped Angelique, she accompanied all this with a shrill cry of how she, the shrew, dared to seduce her cutie. Anthony jumped up, frightened, and rushed towards his sister. Angelica slowly stood up from her seat. She had such a look that Julia took a frightened step back. Then she hit the crazy woman so hard that she flew back before she could come to her senses. She, not expecting a response, and such a strong blow, almost lost her balance and flew to the floor. Angelica said that the mentally ill fool needs treatment. Julia apparently received resistance for the first time in her life. Surprise, resentment, and fear were evident on her face. She shouted at Angelica that she didn't know who she dared to hit. To which she replied, "An eye for an eye, what's the problem?" But the girl considered herself untouchable, so she rushed at her, screaming that she would destroy Angelica, shouting that she was the daughter of the financial director of the Sinai Group, and that she would destroy her. Anthony jumped up and wanted to intercept, but he was beaten to it. Edward grabbed Julia, who was going crazy because the second person dared to stop her. While she was trying to break free, Edward turned to Anthony, saying that he was unable to deal with his girls. What kind of a man was he? Then he disgustedly pushed Julia away, wincing and saying what a disgusting thing, and she asked in confusion, "Who the hell is he?" And then she immediately screamed that she understood everything. He was supporting her, meaning Angelica. Otherwise, why was she so worried? Anthony protected his sister from an inadequate girl, and she insulted Angelica as a dirty woman who dragged Anthony into her filth. Here, Angelica pushed her brother aside, came up and hit the girl even harder than the first time. Then she asked if she was finished, and if so, did they know each other that she was so angry. Then, with an icy look, she approached Julia and said that it was time to introduce herself. Taking her head, she introduced herself as the main heir of the Swoku family, and with her family's finances, she could buy 10 so-called financial groups. Julia screamed that there was no need to threaten her. She didn't believe it anyway. But when she heard the voices in the hall and the mention of the power of the Swoku company, which could crush a small company like Julia's, her arrogance began to subside. Well, when she realized that the girl she insulted and hit was that same Angelica Swoku, she realized that she was in deep trouble. Angelica's look spoke for itself and did not bode well. While passing by, our heroine promised Julia the end of the oligarch's daughter's life. For the first time in her life, Julia understood what punishment was. Grimacing, she began to persuade Angelica not to do it, but she passed by smiling. Anthony said to his sister, half seriously, half jokingly, that there was no need to frighten Mrs. Julia. Then, approaching Julia, who was looking at him with hope as if he were her only salvation, the guy added that he had not yet had time to introduce himself. And when she heard that it was Angelica's brother in front of her, who also added that he did not envy her end, she understood that this was the final ending. The guy laughed without saying anything else, and she just stood there without moving. Then, casually waving his hand goodbye, he turned and followed his sister, hoping that they would see each other again. The recent troublemaker sat on the floor staring at one point, while Edward followed Angelica and Anthony with his eyes. And remembering him, Angelica mockingly and deliberately loudly began to talk about popularity. And looking into the eyes of her ex-husband, she said that before teaching others, you need to look at yourself. Edward couldn't find the words to respond, he just remained silent. Finally, Angelica reminded him what a bastard he was. Taking their brother by the arm, they headed towards the exit, talking about something of their own. The day of the meeting arrived with Julie, President Elvis, Angelica, and Edward gathered in the boardroom. The room fell silent, and Elvis turned to Angelica and said that he heard that all the products of the Sinai Financial Group were returned due to smuggling, worthy of the Swoku family, so cruel. Without taking her eyes off the papers, the girl coldly replied to the director that during working hours she only talked about business. He decided to defuse the situation and, with a fake laugh, added that who could have thought that a famous movie actor would turn out to be Angelica's brother. Then he cast a sly glance at Edward, asking if he was speaking correctly. Angelica was beginning to get annoyed by the behavior of President Elvis, who was enjoying the picture, checking the reaction of the former spouses to each other. When the girl wanted to get up and leave, the president stopped her and said that their products had already reached the stage of finished products, and it was time to prepare a press conference and announce it. At that moment, the door swung open and an employee rushed in, yelling at President Elvis that they had a problem. Everyone was alarmed, and a sweaty employee reported that the Swoku branch in the city of Norton had gotten ahead of the curve with the announcement of smart microcircuits. Everyone turned to Angelica, expecting an explanation from her. Looking into Angelica's eyes, she firmly stated that she could guarantee that she had never distributed information about this project. Edward was the first to speak out about the fact that there was a mole in their team, and it needed to be identified as soon as possible. The girl replied that she would go to Norton herself and sort everything out, and that she had 2 trusted business partners here. And then Edward decided that he should not miss such an opportunity to establish a relationship with her by declaring that he would go with her. When he stood up and said he would go with her, she snapped that there was no need for that. Edward insisted that this was a waste of 3 companies, and she couldn't handle it alone. President Elvis did not miss Edward's intentions, so he supported his idea with a smile, and he himself will be here to control the public reaction. Angelica thought for a moment, but realized that it would be better this way and agreed. But Edward never expected that she would press the papers to his chest and tell him to study them. She also added that he didn't get under her feet. He calmly replied that he wouldn't, and he himself thought that he wouldn't disappoint her. Meanwhile, Professor Mike, an AI specialist, presented the development of a nanochip. Angelica opened the door and entered the conference room, followed by Edward. The girl demanded to stop the presentation. Everyone knows that the development of smart microcircuits is carried out by a joint laboratory of 3 families. Snatching the microphone from the professor, the girl angrily said, "Since when did her and her partner's research become the personal development of Professor Michael Soul?" At this time, filming was taking place in the hall, and Angeli demanded an immediate explanation. The professor, clearly nervous, shouted that this was his project, and that she, a snot-nosed brat, should not interfere if she didn't understand what scientific research was. Then he began to demand that security take Angelica out. When the guards approached, Edward blocked the passage to Angelica with his hand, ordering her to stand. Michael Soul screamed hysterically, "Who allowed them to have a showdown at his press conference? He will complain." Angelica supported him regarding the complaint, saying that she would just tell him about the theft. At that moment, a man appeared in a calm tone asking what they were doing here. It was a relative of the Swoku family, Albert, who said that everything that belonged to the Swoku family belonged to them all. Then he said that he hadn't seen Angelica for so long, but she was still just as hot-tempered. Edward looked at the man in bewilderment, as Angelica said that her uncle needed to know about the unauthorized disclosure of corporate secrets and plagiarism, but did not finish. And then, in an icy voice, she added that it was time to change the president of his branch. The professor and Angelica's relative unabashedly stated that what she calls plagiarism is market capture and the ability to take advantage of opportunities that others have missed. But the girl did not listen to them any further and demanded proof that it was not plagiarism, after which she announced that in 3 days they would prove everything publicly here. The relative, smiling slyly, replied that this was a bad idea. Angelica's words sounded completely unconvincing. Angelica's subsequent words that if they could present evidence, she would give her position to her relative made Edward freeze. They were filmed on camera. Edward, addressing her, asked President Swoku not to get excited, but Angelica replied that this was only the president's position. Edward expressed his sincere willingness to help her, if only she would not speak so seriously about the position of president. But our heroine turned around abruptly and, leaving, said that she didn't need help. Angelica spoke with her older brother, who said that he had sent her help. It was Daniel who greeted the girl with the same soft and captivating smile. How timely, how she needed him, she sincerely exclaimed with joy upon seeing him. The guy said that he had collected all the necessary information. Now everything needed to be checked. They entered the break room and began to sort through papers. How timely he was, to which Daniel assured her that he would always be there when she needed help. And he added to himself that he would not allow her to fall into the trap of an unhappy marriage again. After some time, a suspicious report was discovered. The account did not add up, which was suspicious. The girl looked closely, and Daniel explained that in his opinion there was a problem with the deposit. Angelica smiled contentedly. There is no report on this deferred amount. It looks like her uncle is laundering government money. She was determined to continue investigating why Daniel had called her a hardened workaholic. When he announced the verification of the next documents, the girl had already fallen asleep. He looked at her sleeping, admiring the strength and resilience of this fragile girl. He thought to himself that it was clearly uncomfortable to sleep on the table and took the sleeping Angelica in his arms. Carefully, so as not to wake her, he placed her on the bed. Then he carefully covered her with a blanket, and she smiled in her sleep. When he left her hotel room, Edward stood next to him and asked why Daniel was leaving Angelica's room. And then he sternly asked what kind of relationship they had. But Daniel missed the question about the relationship and asked a counter-question. Edward came to Angelica. Then he added with a smile that President Grand would have to come tomorrow. She was already asleep. The day of the press conference arrived, and when Angelica was leaving her room, Edward was waiting for her, asking her to stop. Her face showed irritation. What he wants? Then Edward said that yesterday he saw Daniel leaving her room. They hesitated. She coldly replied that she should not report on her actions and her personal life. He followed her, asking if she wanted to explain anything, and she rudely replied that she did not. Professor Michael, hearing their squabble, laughed. The conference hadn't even started yet, and they were already arguing. Then Angelica smiled and advised him not to be so self-confident, and she herself can deal with a scumbag like him. He grimaced at the sight of the girl, who carelessly waved her hand at him that they would soon meet at a press conference. Angelica walked out of the building and walked towards the parking lot, looking a little confused as a car pulled up in front of her. It was Daniel greeting her and inviting her to give her a ride. How well Angelica answered and thanked the man. He always appears at the right moment. Before she could even sit down, Edward was catching up with her, furious at the thought that she was constantly with this guy. Edward argued that she was making a mistake by involving outsiders in the business of their companies. Daniel replied with a charming smile that he was President Swoku's personal driver today, or she didn't deserve a driver. Our heroine added with irony, "Well, Mr. Grand sees her only as a bag of blood and nothing more." The car quickly drove away, and Edward once again watched his ex-wife leave with another man. He had nothing to say in response. He had made a lot of mistakes, she was right, but he needed to find a way to make her change her mind about him. In the break room, Angelica listened to Professor Michael's recording. He took the position that his invention was the envy of many, so he would not back down. Sanner, pouring coffee, asked his sister not to pay attention to this clown. The girl replied with a smile that she hoped he would still be able to laugh. And now Angelica is already in the conference room. Reporters are vying with each other to ask questions about this plagiarism scandal. How can she explain the professor's words about the design process being the same as that of her company's branch? The girl said that her relative Albert's company had made a mistake by plagiarizing the early results of their three-way collaboration. An internal audit found that her relative's company had indeed used unacceptable competitive practices. Her uncle and professor turned white after she said that Swoku Company had already submitted a bankruptcy report and reorganization of the Norton branch. Her company would never tolerate anything like that. The camera caught Albert, who denied all the accusations. For what reason, she had no evidence. But the girl continued by saying that the investigation also showed that the smart chip that the professor was talking about was just a failed product. And she introduced the main figure in the investigation, a scientist who received the highest gold award in his professional field, her brother Sanner. After returning home, he began working at the best research institute in the country, and Professor Michael Soul became his new colleague. Sanner then went on to say that he had surveillance footage of Professor Michael stealing data from his computer. And in this data, there were just some unsuccessful calculations. He had already reported it to the police. At this time, Albert shook his hapless partner, asking where the recording came from, but he said that everything was done cleanly. The professor tried to answer something, but he stuttered more, admitting complete defeat. At this time, the police had already entered the hall and charged both of them. Angelica ironically wished her uncle good luck, since embezzling 100 million could result in life imprisonment. The relative growled her name, making it clear that he would find a way to take revenge on her. President Elvis admired the girl. He never thought that she would be able to solve such a difficult problem so easily. How cleverly she managed to get out of such a situation. Edward shared his admiration. She was simply clever. How he admired and was proud of her now. Here she stood in full view of everyone, confident and unwavering. Without taking his loving gaze away, Edward said that she was cool. When Albert was taken away by the police, he broke free and shouted at Angelica that he would kill her. Having escaped from the police, he jumped up to Angelica like a beast, ready to grab her, but Sanner blocked the girl. The police asked the suspect to calm down. The girl, looking at him, said that she would see what he was capable of. When she and Daniel were walking to the car, he, worried about her, suggested that she assign a security guard, but she refused, which was exactly the effect she was trying to achieve. He looked at Angelica and could not hide his admiration. She really was not afraid of anything. Having unlocked the car, they were going to go and have something to eat after such a stressful day. She smiled and added that this time dinner was on her account. At that moment, a car stopped near her. The window was lowered, and she saw Edward, who invited her to get into his car since there was an important meeting about their project soon. Edward addressed her formally as President Swoku. Elvis once again enjoyed the moment when Edward challenged his ex-wife, whom he could not forget. He emphasized that since the plagiarism was resolved, it was necessary to discuss it with the staff. Sanner replied that everything was fine, that she shouldn't worry about him, but that she would eat well before the meeting. The girl glanced sideways at President Elvis and her ex-husband, thinking for a couple of seconds, after which she contacted Director Elvis, who said that the company had issued an official statement explaining the situation. And this statement coincides with her statement, so she will not be present at the meeting. Still smiling, Elvis said, "Well, President Swoku, how can this be?" appealing to the fact that she is one of the founders of the company. Edward interjected his opinion that Director Elvis was right, and that everything that happened was connected to the Swoku family name. But Angelica stopped him. He didn't have to tell her, and if anyone had any questions for her, they should call her, and she would explain everything. Then she turned around and went to Daniel. The guy was surprised, and Angelica laughed and said, "What are we standing there for? Let's go have lunch?" He was genuinely happy and replied, "Of course, let's go." Elvis, watching Edward's gloomy look, said that it seemed he had failed to keep his ex, and that the boy was okay with her, to which Edward ordered to go after them. A meat dish was placed on the table, but Daniel said that they would first order soup to warm up. Angelique was very pleased with his care, and she joked that today he was again playing the role of a gigolo accompanying a rich mistress. Daniel replied that as long as Ange liked it, he would do anything. They now looked like embarrassed schoolchildren. Angelica blushed and lowered her eyes. They were interrupted by the sly voice of Elvis, who pretended to be surprised by their sudden meeting. And without asking permission, he pulled up a chair and sat down at the table. Edward did the same. But he still asked President Swoku if she would mind if they joined. The girl sneered that they had already done so. Edward looked at the dishes on the table and said, "It was he who called you to eat such worthless dishes." When he called the waiter for a new order, our heroine became furious, jumped up sharply and said it was none of his business. How he irritates her. For once he can cast aside his arrogance. She then turned to Daniel and commanded that they leave. Daniel turned to Edward and spoke slowly, looking him intently in the eyes. "It doesn't matter what kind of food someone eats. The most important thing is that Ange likes this food. If he still doesn't understand this after living with her for 3 years, then someone else will." Edward stood up so loudly that Director Elvis became nervous, but he had nothing to say to his opponent, and Angelica and Daniel were already leaving without looking back. Edward was so angry at Daniel that he unbuttoned his tie in an attempt to breathe freely. Elvis, while drinking wine, hinted to him that it was immediately obvious that he had never courted girls, to which Edward replied that Director Elvis had ideas. Of course there is. Now that his ex ignores him, his flashing before her eyes only irritates her. You need to start with what she likes, please her desires, and gradually improve the relationship, and he will tell you about step number 2 later. Edward thought about indulging in the desires that Angelica liked. A few days later, Angelica held a red envelope especially for a limited circle of invitees. The girl gasped. This was an invitation to a famous world business conference. When she found out that this invitation was sent by her ex-husband to make amends, she was even more surprised. This is a private meeting where only 10 people from all over the world can attend. Ha! And Edward suddenly became generous. Why is that? She couldn't refuse such an opportunity, so she went. Her assistant drove her to the airport and asked if it would not be too generous to give the Grand family land in the west of the city. But the girl explained that this conference would help her family open up the European market, so part of the land was simply an equal exchange. He understandingly agreed and replied that he would instruct his staff to develop a plan for further action to develop the European market. When they arrived at the airport, the assistant suggested that Angelica rest in the lounge while he checked in. They were closely watched from the start of their journey to the airport, and when the assistant walked away, the man in black moved after Angelica. Her relative Albert could not calm down with the fact that Angelique had caused the ruin of his family. When the girl in the restroom relaxed while listening to music, he brought a rag with chloroform to her face. The girl did not understand what happened and lost consciousness. As Albert was dragging her out of the room, the assistant returned and shouted who he was and what he was doing with Madame Angelique. He only ordered silence. Some of the passengers in the room looked at what was happening with confusion. Taking out a knife and holding it to the girl's face, he shouted for no one to come near, otherwise he would stab her. He then ordered his assistant to tell her family that they had brought 10 billion and were going to a warehouse in the suburbs, otherwise they would only get her corpse. The assistant stood in complete confusion. The room was filled with a hum. Where is the security? Or maybe this kidnapping was organized by this grand family again. Albert brought her to the warehouse, tied her to a chair, and splashed water on her to wake her up. At first, when the girl opened her eyes, she did not immediately understand what had happened. But when she saw Albert, she understood everything. He smirked. There she was, tied up and helpless, never expecting to fall into his hands. In anger, he grabbed her by the hair so hard that Angelica screamed, accusing her of ruining his life. His family, everything because of her. He hit her in the face. But the girl in turn asked who was to blame for the fact that he stole state money, and so he got what he deserved. He got angry at these words and attacked her with a knife, shouting that she still imagined herself to be the president of Suoku, so he could cut her throat right now and take the money. Then she said that all the shares were registered in her name, and if she died, the Suoku company would automatically donate everything to those in need. At that moment, Edward and Daniel, who opened the door, were shouting her name. Albert, shouting for them not to come near, put a knife to Angelica's throat. Daniel asked the conditions under which Albert would release Angelique, and Edward reported that everything was cordoned off by the police. This caused the kidnapper to panic, but he demonstrated his main trump card. He had nothing to lose. Edward moved forward, but Daniel stopped him, pointing out Albert's condition. He could harm Angelica. First, they needed to discuss everything outside. There was police outside, and Angelica's whole family arrived. The father and brothers were in a panic. They wanted to know that Angelica was okay, that Albert had not harmed her. Daniel explained the situation that Angelica was fine, but Albert was not himself, so there was no point in provoking him. He suggested that everyone stay outside while he went inside, but Edward resolutely volunteered to go. He was participating in peacekeeping operations. Everyone looked at each other. Someone wanted to object, but no one openly contradicted. Edward unbuttoned his jacket, saying that there were no objections. He was going, and he headed towards the entrance to the warehouse, thinking that he would help Angelica at least once. Albert meanwhile mocked the girl, telling her that those who came to save her simply left and that things weren't going so well for her. She countered by saying that she was clearly better than him and that she wouldn't get a life sentence. These words enraged him, and he kicked her with all his might, and the girl fell off the chair. He expressed his last words that it was all because of her. She ruined his life. Angelica saw boxes next to which stood 3 bottles. The sight of her tied up and lying on the floor sent her captor into a fit of hysterical laughter. She looked like a beaten dog, he said. But all possible variations of how to save her life flashed through her head. Albert suggested begging him. Maybe if he was in a good mood, he would let her go, but the girl sent him away with his proposal. He was infuriated by Angelica's arrogance. Even in such a situation, she was not broken. At this time, Eugene was in contact with the police, who said they would be here soon. The older brother also said that he would contact the air rescue team to avoid any unforeseen circumstances. Albert grabbed Angelica by the hair so hard that she cried out in pain. Mocking the girl, he asked what it was like when none of her relatives came to help. But Angelica did not lose heart, and without fear, she replied that she would not allow him to receive a penny from her family, which provoked Albert's aggression. He hissed maliciously, "Everything here is covered in gasoline, so they will leave together." She managed to kick him in the face, and the kidnapper, who had not expected this, recoiled. His cheek still hurt from the blow. He brought his hand to that place, calling it a creature. He decided to act. But before he could do anything, Edward burst into the room, throwing the door open with a sharp blow. Albert grinned. Well, it's the Grand Director. He came to save his ex-wife. Raising the knife and about to slash Angelica, he said, "The hero has come to save his princess." In a decisive tone, Edward was ready to listen to Albert's conditions. The girl sat tensely, keeping her eyes on her relative, trying to find the right moment. While he began to lay out what he wished for the life of President Swoku, Angelica managed to take a piece of broken glass, and she tried to cut the rope that tied her hands. Albert's condition was 500 million, transfer now. Angelica spoke up, declaring that Edward should not even think about transferring the money. He would not let her go anyway. In a rage, he swung the knife at Angelica, who closed her eyes in anticipation of the blow. Edward screamed her name in horror. It was clear that Albert was losing control. But when he saw Edward approaching, he fearfully ordered not to move, or he would kill the girl. Once again, the sharp blade of the knife touched her neck. Albert warned that next time he might not stop and ruin her face. Edward stopped, feverishly thinking about what to do. Albert, seeing his confusion, said that he liked to do business with straightforward people like President Grand. He would transfer the money right now. Angelica understood that the criminal would not let her out alive anyway. Her only salvation was to free her hands. "We need to act quickly. We can't let Edward fall into this trap." Edward entered the account number and the amount. All that was left was to click Confirm Sending. Albert couldn't wait for the money to come in, as everything was simple and open with Director Grand. The transfer was completed. Edward watched expectantly as Albert looked at the result of the transaction with a satisfied smile. And at that moment, he jumped up and punched him in the face with the words, "Unlike you, I have everything according to my conscience." Albert's face expressed a mixture of rage, confusion, and helplessness. He screamed at Edward like a wounded animal. With another deft kick, he knocked Albert to the floor. He didn't have time to come to his senses. He screamed in pain, but Edward didn't give him the opportunity to get up. He stepped on Albert's hand, and he howled in sharp pain. Edward could barely contain his desire to kill him on the spot, but he pulled himself together and said that he would settle accounts with him later. He ran up to Angelica, asking if everything was okay with her. He would help her free herself. He looked at her tied hands and said angrily that he would never forgive this creature for doing this to her. While he was untying the girl's hands, Albert stood up, swaying from the effects of the blows. His eyes showed the complete madness of a man who had nothing to lose, and he struck the wheel of his lighter, saying that they forced him to do it. Meanwhile, Edward freed Angelica's hands, and she thanked him for his help. At that moment, there was a deafening explosion, and everything behind them was engulfed in fiery flames. There was horror on the faces of Edward and Angelica. They realized that Albert had gone to extreme measures. He stood with a knife and laughed with a crazy smile. They wanted to leave so easily, it won't work. And he rushed at Angelica with a knife, wishing her to die. Edward covered her with himself. The girl opened her mouth, but was too horrified to utter a word. A cry escaped from his chest cautiously. Edward covered it with himself when in the blink of an eye, Albert ran up to them with a knife. The light of metal flashed, and Albert plunged the knife into Edward's back. He swayed, but did not retreat from Angelica, hugging her and covering her with his body. Then he took his hand with his other hand. A sharp pain pierced his body. There was a buzzing in his ears. From somewhere far away, he heard Angelica's voice shouting his name to the lice. Edward croaked that he was guilty before her for what he had done before. Now he would do everything to protect her. Angelica held him back, saying that she was not the same victim. First, they needed to get out of here. Behind them, they heard Albert, who said not to even dream about it. Edward was in unbearable pain. He laid his head on Angelica. The fire was getting stronger. He asked her to leave him here. Without losing control and composure, she looked angrily at the relative who had driven them into such a situation. Having carefully sat Edward down and told him not to move, our heroine was determined to get out alive. Standing in front of Albert, full of strength and courage, looking at him with contempt, she declared how such scum could have been born into their family. Remembering her old tricks, she suddenly jumped up to the stunned Albert. Another second, and her knee hit him in the solar plexus so hard that he wheezed from the pain in his chest. He curled up in 3 deaths, unable to straighten up from the pain, and Angelica commented on her blow. It was for stealing money. Albert was losing control of his consciousness. He felt so bad. Then, with a movement of the fighter, she kicked the relative who had just gotten to his feet. This is number 2 for her kidnapping. He was lying next to the fiery flame at her feet. The girl said, looking at him, that he was a nuisance to society. It was his big mistake to get out of prison. Blood oozed from his distorted face, and he called her a creature and wished for everyone in her family to die. Still just as coldly, she said, "Oh, well, well." Her hand tightly clutched the bottle she had previously picked up from the floor. Holding it above her in the air, Angelica said that before she died herself, she would send him to hell. A bottle of alcohol flew at him, shattering into small pieces and causing a new explosion of flames that engulfed the screaming Albert. Throwing it down, she ran to Edward, who was bleeding. She tried to get her ex-husband to his feet and said that she would get him out of here. Edward tried to dissuade her. He couldn't go. The flames grew, the heat was unbearable, and the building only had a few minutes left to stand. Angelica stubbornly lifted Edward up, declaring that she would not leave him here, thinking to herself that she could not remain in such a debt to him. He gently took her hand and again asked for forgiveness for past debts, just so that she could live. He didn't need more. He placed her hand over his heart, hoping that she could forgive him before he died. Taking him on herself and leading him to the exit, she called on him to stop talking nonsense. They would pay off their debts as soon as they got out of here, but the man asked her to leave. She would die here because of him. He could barely walk, leaning on her. It was hard to breathe from the smoke, and a veil was clouding his eyes. Suddenly, Edward used his remaining strength to push her forward, shielding her from the falling ceiling. A huge wooden beam, split by the fire, flew towards the place where the girl stood. She sat on the floor, looking for Edward with her eyes. Her chest ached. Why did he do this? He lay unconscious on the floor, screaming his name. She tried to wake him up, feeling her consciousness leaving her. Her strength was leaving her, but she tried to force herself to breathe. The building was becoming increasingly engulfed in flames. The fire brigade arrived and began to extinguish the fire. When the door to the burning room was knocked down, Daniel jumped in and ran to the unconscious Angelica. He wrapped himself and her in a blanket, picked them up and carried them to the exit, shouting to the firemen that there was another person here, pointing at Edward. 4 years ago, Angelica found herself in a similar situation, which brought her together with Edward. The terrorists seized a building in which there were many people. They shot indiscriminately, killing women and children. Angelica was overcome with fear and heard them walking between the rows, talking so as not to leave anyone alive. Angelica sat behind a bench, covering her ears with her hands, shaking in panic. Her thought was, is she really going to die here today? What a pity. One of the invaders discovered her, throwing aside the partition and saying that he found you, Beauty. Angelica screamed and was ready to say goodbye to life, when the man covered her with his body, standing in front of the terrorist with a weapon. She only sighed heavily, numb from the horror that had gripped her. Then Edward saved her for the first time. That's how they met. She fell in love with him at first sight. She looked at him as if he were that very prince from fairy tales who saves the princess. It was their first meeting. He so bravely closed her with himself, risking his life. Edward became her hero, saving her from terrorists, and later, in spite of everything, she married him, living a miserable life in marriage. And this time everything was modeled in a similar way. He saved her again. As Daniel carried her out of the room, he shouted for them to call an ambulance quickly. How worried he was that something might happen to Angelica. Edward lay in the ward with his head bandaged, not yet having regained consciousness. Grace stood over her son, groaning at what he had done. Laura, seething with anger, called her brother so stupid, risking his life because of this damned woman. Grace cursed Angelica because of her Edward's whole body was damaged. Laura said angrily that since Angelica is now president, let her come and take care of her brother and generally work hard for their family. Old Man Grand laughed contentedly and noted that Laura had finally grown up and was speaking to the point. He rubbed his hands. There was a greedy light in his eyes. Let Edward and Angelica marry again, and all her inherited property become a dowry. The women supported the plan. It was a great idea. All her property would go to them, and they would become the richest family. Edward woke up to their conversations. He coughed, trying to stop them. His mother and sister vied with each other to ask him to get better. They would make sure that his kindness was repaid in full, and Laura promised that she would be the one to bring Angelica to her knees. With difficulty rising, Edward said to leave Angelica alone. It was his personal choice. The grandfather, contentedly rubbing his beard and not listening to his grandson, advised him to rest, and he would visit his ex. She seemed to be in the next room. His family turned around and headed towards Angelica in a crowd to demand an explanation. Edward also began to get out of bed. Ordering his assistant not to stand, but to help, he needed to catch up with his family. The brother fed Angelica with a spoon, trying to surround her with care. Anthony, almost in tears, shared his impressions of the terrible picture that happened in that warehouse after her rescue. His voice wavered, tears welled up in his eyes. It would have been better if he had suffered instead of her. In a fit of revenge against his bastard uncle, he shoved a spoon into her mouth so hard that she almost choked. His father hit him on the head from behind, pointing at Ange, who almost choked. Angelica laughed merrily at all this, asking her father not to scold Anthony. He was just caring about her. He bit his lip and plaintively agreed with his sister, and the father said menacingly that he forgave for the sake of his little girl. Everyone laughed merrily, while Eugene was seriously questioning the nurse. She advised to leave the patient in the hospital for a few days. A lot of smoke had entered her lungs. Then he approached the others and said that the relative had stabbed them in the back by kidnapping her, and if something had happened to her, the father would not have survived it. The girl cheerfully said that they should forget. It was all in the past. Then her gaze became serious and worried. She remembered Edward, who was also here in the hospital, and asked how he was. Anthony immediately jumped up, blaming her ex-husband for everything. If it weren't for his invitation, she wouldn't have had to suffer so much. But Eugene objected. Angelica was kidnapped by their relative, a member of their family, and Edward saved her at the risk of his life. But Anthony was adamant. He was still not grateful to him. He was involved in what happened. Sanner suggested that everyone leave and let his sister rest, and everyone agreed. The brothers wanted to spend more time with their sister, but the girl needed more rest and gain strength. When they came out, Angelica looked at the tree branches, which were enveloped in rays of sunlight. This is how fate turned out. Due to random circumstances, she found herself in debt to Edward. Her thoughts were interrupted by footsteps and the loud opening of the doors to the ward. The Grand family, led by the head, entered her room with a triumphant look. His eyes grinned. Leaning on his cane, he said that his Edward had suffered greatly because of her. She did not want to explain. The girl said, "Okay, it started, and what kind of explanation is Grandpa Grand waiting for?"